We are live. This is Dark Journalists, and I'm joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And our special guest tonight is Gigi Jung.
Hello.
Gigi, it's great to see you.
Thank you for having me.
That's fantastic. Now, one of the great things about tonight, we've had some very interesting breakthroughs technologically, and but we have our sound and picture flowing just right, and we have a lot of very important information for you in this X episode 68. This is Lindbergh, the Roswell UFO mystery. Now, certainly, I started with Lindbergh in the HotZone on this, Gigi, because he spent so much time in the HotZone, as we're going to find out, but there's something particularly unusual about him being around the Roswell incident as deeply as he is, and this is quite a breakthrough. When we're done tonight, it's going to be a different history around his participation and Wernher von Braun's participation in the Roswell UFO crash. But it's always interesting, Gigi, when we get around this, the UFO issue seems to open up and the UFO file information comes out whenever we get into these historical figures.
Yeah, it does. It's very interesting. And especially with Lindbergh, it seems like whenever there's something kind of mystical going on or like that, it's like he's there. It's very interesting.
Fascinating. I want to remind everyone, too, that in the second part of the program, we're going to be taking your questions on the show and for Gigi Jung. And so just ask them all in caps, because Miss Olivia will be taking the questions and creating this amazing tapestry as she does. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up. I always say I like to open up with a TKO. So what I'm going to do is show us a little bit about Lindbergh that connects him directly into the X-steganography series that we're doing here tonight. And I also want to mention that this being episode 68 of the X series, it is the first time in earnest that we have covered Charles Lindbergh, although he came up in the Tom Garden episode, and his mystical connections to the mystery schools, to the UFO file, to advanced technology, to secret societies are really going to blow some people away. So I'm very much looking forward to this. It's great to have everyone here. It's already a great crowd. Let's take a look at this for a TKO right off the bat. We are looking here at Charles Lindbergh's signature, and Olivia said there was tons of red pens there. Let's say, I'll take that one in the box. or not.
Okay.
Beautiful.
This is the special red pen that you got as a gift.
Yes, and I wanted to say thank you to Miguel out there who sent this. I am using it here. It's such a nice pen. As Olivia knows, when I use pens, I throw them around and they break. So I won't be using this every show, but this is a terrific
This is a gorgeous pen.
So thank you. And he did put some very nice markings on here. Here, as we can see, we've got an X embedded directly in Lindbergh's signature. It's undeniable. And we're used to seeing this when we do this program, but if you're just looking at those things, you'd say, well, somebody signs their signature with an X. When we talk about X-steganography, which is the art of seeing something and communicating to others what you're seeing at a distance, which is where we get that, it's that people can look at these things and understand that they're tracking a program. And we've shown hundreds of examples of this X-steganography, and that's why we're here with the X series, because what the X-steganography does is it opens up, like the Rosetta Stone, an entire set of symbols, an entire set of links that we can then go back and see, this is what they're trying to suggest here. And you could consider it as kind of a footprint of a particular group moving through time. And by the time they get to the 20th century, they're really using it heavily in secret technology programs. We see the X again in Lindbergh's signature here. Undeniable, really. This is a very interesting move on his part, I would say. And just to make sure for all you skeptics out there, that is the third example. And it is undeniable that this L, he turns into an X. So in this case, it suggests both a knowledge of secret societies and also advanced technology in his family lineage. And I'm going to prove that out as we go. Now, what I'm going to do is a little intro here on Charles Lindbergh, and then we're going to bring Gigi in to give us a lot of what we've been working on with this episode. And we worked very closely together on this episode. In fact, I would say that there's a lot of psychic archaeology that shows up in this episode and really expands it. And that's very Gigi. So let's get into this. First of all, when we talk about Lindbergh, I want to say we're talking about a true American hero. And this is somebody who deserves the title very much. And there's not going to be anything tonight so much about his secret life or his other families in Germany. I know that there are things about Lindbergh that are salacious on a personal level. But the truth is that in terms of his effort and what he put forward, I think that he was a true American hero. And so I won't be saying anything tonight that's going to go against his character at all. As a matter of fact, I think we're all going to end up admiring him even more. But at the age of 25, Charles Lindbergh would go across the Atlantic and in 1927 and create the first transatlantic flight, 33 hours to Paris, France, and be greeted as a hero and really usher in the transatlantic flight. This is an amazing move for a 25-year-old with very limited equipment in the spirit of St. Louis. And we're going to show you that. But that's a shot of him there in his prime, giving us some idea of the real character of the man. Now, Lindbergh, right off the bat, has some very interesting mystical ties. In the Scottish Rite Journal of the Masons, of course, I should say that off the top that Lindbergh was a Mason openly. So they say a few interesting things here in the Scottish Rite Journal. They say, like many great men before and after him, Charles Lindbergh came to Freemasonry before coming to greatness. This is through his family. He completed his Masonic degrees in 1926 at Keystone Lodge, number 243 in Missouri, just months before his historic flight brought him world renown. Although little of his Masonic record is otherwise known, there's probably a good reason for that, Lindbergh did wear a square and compass pin during his flight. The spirit of St. Louis was adorned with a Masonic emblem. It's very important for us to get that there is a group now openly behind him when he's doing this, and he is exhibiting his support association with them. As a hero of aviation, Lindbergh stood for all that the public thought of as essentially American: independence, self-reliance, and courage and perseverance. Lindbergh, as a Freemason, represents a long line of explorers and adventurers down the ages, from Lewis and Clark to polar explorers to astronauts such as Buzz Aldrin. Buzz Aldrin's going to be very important, and it's interesting they mention him in the same breath here because Buzz Aldrin's dad, it turns out, was a very close friend of Charles Lindbergh. And there's so many interesting things in this family entanglement of these two that we're going to get to. But one of the things I want to put out right away is that Aldrin, who had a very interesting, spectacular career as the second astronaut on the moon, and he's also quite old for the job at the young age of 39. But it is interesting because when you look at his career afterwards, a great many of things that he spoke about, he had tremendous psychological issues from going on this moon trip and all the secrecy he had to take with him after the fact, including a very heavy-duty alcoholism period of time and disasters in his relationships. And shortly before he went to the moon, his mother committed suicide. His mother is a very interesting woman, and her name, interestingly enough, her maiden name, was Marion Moon. I mean, this is very interesting.
I was shocked when you told me that. It's crazy. But even more shocking, I mean, that's crazy. But for a mother, a proud mother, this was, an extraordinary achievement for her to kill herself before her son achieved this, when she could experience all this glory vicariously, is very suspicious.
Or I absolutely agree. I would just think a mother's general concern for his mission also. So I'm sure it's a tragedy, but Gigi, it's a tragedy that has a strange ring to it.
Yeah, my impression psychically, even just hearing it, is that I think both the Lindberghs and the Aldrins were probably raised really, really, really strictly, almost abusively, really tough. And so it doesn't surprise me that I mean, when you start to achieve this level of opportunity and recognition in society, it's often because of, position and stuff, but sometimes abuse. And I think that's what was going on. And I think that's probably part of why Marion did that. I'm just putting it out there.
It's absolutely fascinating. You and I did a lot of name excavation, as we have done before on the Hemingways, for example. And we did it in this case because the name Augustus kept coming up over and over again. And so I'm going to show some examples of his family and Lindbergh's background and how the name Lindbergh and Augustus get in there in the first place. And then I want to come in and really go over this Augustus-August theme. But the first theme, I guess, that we have there, Gigi, is the name itself, Moon. The fact that Buzz Aldrin's mom's name is Moon is instantly we have the name recognition going on.
It's very ritualistic.
Yeah.
It's almost like sometimes when you get to these societies or schools, they do very, very, very large scale rituals in the naming of their children, the naming of their companies, their businesses, things like this. They're long-term rituals. And sometimes even the things our children are going to do or achieve, even though there's a bit of a blood sport or competition there, even those are kind of a ritualistic thing. So it doesn't surprise me. It doesn't surprise me at all. We even found some of the names were Eve and Lilith. Obviously, Augustus is a very symbolic name. So they're using their own lives and their own selves in a very ritualistic way. That's what I would say.
Absolutely. The names, they become a kind of signature. That's what I'm getting the most of there, which is the name itself starts to represent a position. And this is what we get with August Hemingway and Augustus Hemingway and August Lindbergh. And as we go deeper into who Lindbergh's dad married, it's someone by the name of Evangeline Lodgeland. And when we look at this with the names, again, if we go back there into her history, we find Edward Augustus, and we find Augustus Edward. And so we're finding Charles Augustus, and Augustus is showing up periodically throughout the Hemingway names, throughout the Lindbergh names, and now throughout Lindbergh's mother's names. We are finding this term over and over again.
Yeah, we are. And it obviously goes back to Emperor Augustus. It goes back to the changing of the calendar. Obviously August was added as a month. It wasn't originally there. And so that's immediately where my mind went is, okay, well, wasn't August kind of added very randomly? Didn't they change our perception of time around that name?
Absolutely.
In the month, and they added July as well, but they added it as the 8th month. And so I kind of really tuned into the 8 there, and I was really interested in the 8 because they changed the month about 8 years before Christ.
Right.
Which was significant, and the word, the etymology or the sound, because sometimes when the etymology disappears, you can't find where August started, because the Romans kind of created their own thing, they did their own thing, and they changed things a little bit. And so I went to the sound of Og, just Og, and just OG. That's how the Celts or the Gauls would have said it. They would have been OG, Og, Aga. And then it brought us to the Ogham calendar, which is also a calendar, just like August was added to our calendar. So why are these 8-fold calendars and the number 8 in calendars coming up? And then I went back to Egypt and we found Ogdod, which is actually meaning a group of 8. And it's actually it shows up around the god Ptah. And Ptah is a series of 8 beings. And so you start seeing this almost holy, and of course we've already talked about the 8th chakra, which is kind of the Christed chakra that includes all chakras. And so you start getting into this really deep mystery stuff around just that name, and you can kind of see how it has these incarnations with the sound Og.
Absolutely. Well, there's always that thing about 8 is the infinity symbol.
Right. Yeah.
And
that's a good one too.
Yeah. What it reminds me of is that we have a group that's operating, and then there's this echo of the name. Now we're going to find out where in Lindbergh's case this even came up in the first place as we go a little bit into his family history. And I want to remind everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is episode 68 of the Steganography series, and it is Lindbergh, the Roswell UFO mystery. As I said, we originally called it Lindbergh in the Hot Zone because he was there so much, and we're going to bring out all of his work in the Hot Zone. Yes.
Shamanist Anam Kara wanted to remind us that August 8th is the Lion's Gate portal in astrology each year.
Yes. That is a really interesting point. And we're going to find ourselves up to our necks in Lions and Eagles here shortly, Gigi.
Great. Right up my alley.
We have to reference, Gigi has done a series of very interesting videos on her own about lions and these types of archetypal symbols for these beings. Very interesting stuff. And I highly recommend Gigi's work at gigiyoung.com, and also her work on YouTube is outstanding. Gigi, you recently achieved 60,000 subscribers on YouTube. Congratulations.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Some of the best, most cutting edge work going on there. Let's take a quick look here when we get into Lindbergh's past, because we have so many kind of good things in his future, but I think we need to find out where this all started. Before we go there, the Spirit of St. Louis itself is a very interesting history, and I could have done a show just focusing on the occult symbolism of the Spirit of St. Louis. But there are a couple of things I want to bring up for sure when it comes to this. One is this. Now, let's take a look here. I'm going to show the original propeller, the front cone of the propeller for the Spirit of St. Louis, the original. And this is all signed by the various mechanics who worked on it.
Wow.
And in the middle is quite clearly the Indian swastika, which in this case, 1927, is saying it's a good luck charm.
Mm-hmm.
However, we know that the Theosophical Society had used this, and that later it gets adopted through the National Socialist Party that becomes the Nazi Party, and they do their own sort of version of it, their own twist with it. To see it right there on the cone head of the propeller from the Spirit of St. Louis, though, Gigi, that tells us immediately we're in occult territory with this flight.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was in the time where it's almost like it was becoming trendy or something in the mysteries or something like that, because it really started popping up. But yeah, they're almost doing it for the swastika or something. It's definitely, and even the names on it,
yes,
is very magical.
It's so jarring to go back and look at this with the history that comes after. Now, certainly, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, the swastika, or like is there another name for it? Is that just what it's called?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so it was used for navigation, I believe. That's why it was such a special star. It's a star. That's what the pattern actually is. And so it's interesting that they would use that there, because people would use that to navigate with.
The ultimate sun symbol. And what's weird is you can find, of course, the swastika embedded in ancient temples in Israel, and in India and in Tibet. So it's used as this power symbol, and the Nazis appropriate it at a certain point. It's my belief, although I've read the different versions of how it got there, it's my belief that they actually appropriated it from the Theosophical Society and decided to do their own sort of occult twist with it. And, from time to time, you hear people who will say, well, Blavatsky, she helped the Nazis or whatever. First of all, Blavatsky died in 1891, and that's like 30 years before the Nazis even started. And anyone could sort of pick up mystical work and adopt it as their own. And the fact that they adopted some of her themes, she had nothing to do with Nazism. And she would have been, as Steiner was, completely opposed to it. And when we think about Rudolf Steiner's work, the Nazis went after Steiner, as a matter of fact, because they burnt down the Goetheanum because they didn't like the occult competition. So that's the way we can look at that, Gigi. If anything, they're coming in on the kind of negative aspect of that magic side. Yeah,
that's what happens with all psychopaths, is they take something and then they distort it. It happens with religion. It happens with anything. And, it's not anything new. I just think that the work on root races, the symbols, I just think that not a lot of people are aware of it. So it's so much easier to not understand it and then just write it off. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually, because it's important to talk about the root races. And if you find a way in society to cut off that conversation by saying, oh, well, it's a racist thing, or, the Nazis used it, therefore you can't talk about it. I find that interesting because, of course, the Nazis adopted a lot of things from esoteric traditions, and they used them in their own maraudings. However, the esoteric principles don't change. Just like the Nazis had churches, we still have churches. So it's a very interesting thing in society when we go and we look back at Blavatsky or we look at Steiner and their work on root races. They're giving us a great overview of how, for example, the Atlantean race, the Egyptian race, the Chaldeans, they all play a role in advancing humanity. I find this interesting that they're trying to kind of shut off any discussion of race by putting it around in this kind of propaganda about racism. I think that's one of those ways to keep you from empowering yourself. And
empowering yourself, and also discovering yourself and who you are and your place in the world, and also to look at the world as a larger picture. One of the problems that we have in the world is we have no sense of our own history, our own past, our own evolution, where we came from. You really infantilize a society by doing that. So, yeah, not thinking in long strides.
Well, isn't that fascinating, too? Because when we think about some of the reports that just came out about the major comet hit 12,800 years ago, this is right in that timeline where Cayce has Atlantis' final sinking, and we have people like Graham Hancock telling us 10,500 BC, that's when all of this culture, this advanced culture, got wiped out. Here we are talking about Atlantis. People in this show, people in this audience, in the ideas room, which is, other people would call their chat, we call it the ideas room because there's so many talented minds in there. This is very interesting to me because it is Atlantis, in a way, is even more suppressed in terms of the knowledge around it than the UFO file is, because you're dealing there with an advanced human civilization.
Yeah, and you're also dealing with a very advanced civilization in every way. And to even get a piece of that, a memory of that, or an inkling of that can change you. It can reactivate something within you. And so it includes the UFO file. It includes healing. It includes so much so much more valuable things in the UFO file, but it also includes that. So they definitely, there's definitely groups that don't want that to come forward, for the impact that it have.
Well, Gigi, what's the danger for those groups if people start to rediscover their own past links to an advanced lost civilization, which we know as Atlantis?
Well, you begin to reclaim your energy and you begin to reclaim your power, and less of your personal energy, your chi, your prana, goes into just be lost or channeled or harvested by the media or by whatever. You start using your energy in a more succinct way, and that means that systems can actually fall when they need to fall because you're not unconsciously feeding them. And so that's why they have everything to lose. So, and we have everything to gain by just beginning to play with these ideas, not even necessarily believing them, but just playing with them, just having, just getting them in your system and just seeing how they feel. So.
Yeah, well, you've done your own videos on Atlantis and things, and it's interesting to get people to reflect on this. They start to connect with it. What I find interesting is when researchers like Graham Hancock talk about how we're a culture with amnesia. It's a major problem, because whenever we go in historical circles for archaeology, they'll say Sumeria. That's where it starts. Go from Sumeria. And, if you're dealing with biblical thought, they've got it locked. Hey, you get your 5000 BC and on down. Cayce's work, the work of the mystery schools, bringing this out through theosophy, through anthroposophy, and we'll find these links to Lindbergh in these mystery schools. They start to let out this truth that actually civilization goes back a lot further, and that the Atlantean culture, they have it starting somewhere about 200,000 BC. I mean, so it's a pretty big discrepancy there. 5,000 BC versus 200,000 BC. What are you going to do with those 195,000 years?
Yeah. I mean, imagine how many cycles things have risen and fallen. And one of the really, I think, beautiful things that we sometimes forget is that every era had a different kind of blossoming of consciousness. So It's not just time, it's also a consciousness that we can regain and a perspective that we can regain and that we can kind of become more whole. So it has really deep value for us. And even with my videos, just by people sharing their stories, other people remember. So there seems to be this really interesting chain reaction that happens where if everybody kind of just talks about it, it actually unlocks other people. So it's really fascinating. Atlantis is also a fascinating psychic and kind of psychological thing as well, because people do unlock by hearing others.
Oh, that's a good term, actually, unlock. And I think that's what we're looking for here on this show, actually. While Lindbergh was in flight on the Spirit of St. Louis with all these magical symbols everywhere, and with the Masonic people saying, hey, he was wearing our regalia, this is what he said as soon as he realized that he was going to head into Paris and it was going to be successful. All these voices started to show up in the cockpit. And he didn't think he was going mad or anything. He just started to notice it, and they seemed to be kind of egging him on. And here's what he had to say in his own autobiography. These phantoms speak with human voices, friendly, vapor-like shapes, without substance, able to vanish or appear at will, to pass in and out through the walls of the fuselage, as though no walls were there. At times, voices come out of thin air itself, clear yet far away, traveling through distances that can't be measured by the scale of human miles, familiar voices, conversing and advising on my flight, discussing problems of my navigation, reassuring me, giving me messages of importance unattainable in ordinary life. Gigi, he's breaking through there to some other consciousness in the plane.
Yeah, I mean, the swastika was working. It was working its magic in the front of the plane. That's probably something that he could have been trained in. He could have been trained or gifted as I mean, if you look at the Spirit of St. Louis and you see how he was flying with there was no front window. Yeah, like you said, there was no front window. It was all intuition.
Incredible.
And so you would need to be a psychic or a Superman to kind of achieve. I mean, most people would probably panic in that situation. So he definitely had, I think, some psychic abilities that were allowing him to do that.
No question. Miss Olivia.
Yeah, I realize that it's exactly like Luke.
And Star Wars.
Yes, in that final scene where he shoots
The Death Star.
the Death Star, and that he doesn't use the navigation equipment, he doesn't use the guide, he does it all through the Force.
He shuts off his targeting computer.
Yes.
It's really good, actually. When you go deep into that story, it's amazing the things that he didn't use, even that were in vogue at the time.
And it's almost like, it's funny because when you look at the old newspaper articles, you see that the flight took 33 hours. And I'm like, oh, did it? Did it take 33 and a half or 33 hours? Like, it just seems like a very,
yes,
like you got your degree, you know, like, or you know what I mean? It seems
33rd degree.
Yeah. It seems
33 years old for Jesus when he is crucified. 33 is the ultimate in that sense. Absolutely. That's a great observation. It's interesting too. I think that he's starting to shock himself. And at a certain point, he talks about how this experience can't be held in just one incarnation only. I found that very interesting because it references reincarnation in this flight in 1927, showing this, before reincarnation's really out there en masse.
It's almost like it's almost like he's saying he's like Christ-like, because if you consider Steiner's teachings on Christ, not one soul could fit into that. So it's almost like it's very, it's very Christ-like. It is. The 33, the comments, maybe he's been told that.
It is the spirit of St. Louis, after all. Yeah.
One of the other things I've heard about 33 is that when people die and then they appear to their loved ones who are still incarnate, that they appear as they were when they were 33.
Oh, that's very interesting.
I heard that too, but from many psychics as well who are mediums that see. I've heard that. Yeah.
That's fascinating. Hopefully they cut a really good look at 33.
Well, I think that's it. Is that sort of at your peak as an adult,
There's a lot with that. Actually, in anthroposophy, they talk about how the soul, they kind of picture it like a loop, and the soul comes in, and when it comes in, we're talking in infancy, and by the time it goes to come out, that's 33, which is this Christ. That's what the symbol is of Christ being crucified. That's in this era where the body starts to reascend. That's very esoteric stuff, but we can see.
I didn't think of it, but someone in the chat said if you change the 3s to face each other, it's an 8. So a 33.
I'm all about the 8s lately. I love that. I love that.
Gigi, we're going to go back to the August thing in a minute here too, because I think that there's something particularly special about how this came about. But I'm going to jump ahead to the end of the episode and then work our way back. Here we have Lindbergh later in life now. Let's move this around. And there he is with Wernher von Braun. Now, it will be noted that the Nazis took a great interest in Lindbergh in the 30s before they were at war with America and the rest of the world, and that they had a number of things like awards for different Americans, and they gave Henry Ford an award, and they gave Lindbergh an award. Actually, it was Hermann Goering who gave him the award, and he, of course, was another incredible flight guy. but also one of the guys at the trial of Nuremberg who tried to cheat death by convincing someone to give him a cyanide capsule in his cell. So these guys are the incredible, kind of shady on one side with all these accomplishments on the other. But I think it's interesting with Lindbergh, looking at him with von Braun, because we're going to find that there are details and records and witness testimony about these two people being at the site of the Roswell UFO crash at the base. And it comes from very credible sources. But it's laying there in these books. And, I want to mention that there are books, and when Stanton Friedman was with us, he was a great researcher, and we always had great conversations. And he was really the preeminent Roswell researcher. I like the work of Don Schmidt on Roswell as well, and I want to recommend him when it comes to this subject. But Roswell has been, marketed and over-publicized and all the rest of it, and it's been manipulated by both sides, the skeptics and the believers and the intelligence community. But fundamentally, I want to get into what Roswell was and why they would be there. So Roswell Crash itself, and this is the kind of popular rendition that we do on it, which is on July 4th in 1947, there was this amazing crack that was heard by all these ranchers and people. And somebody saw an incredible flash. And then we have the story of Mac Brazel, who's the rancher, who goes out and sees strewn for miles across the back of his ranch all of this incredible debris. So the story is well known in UFO circles, but very often it's cast into doubt by saying, well, it was a weather balloon and that kind of a thing, which they try to pan off on the government side. Those explanations were ridiculous because what happened was the intelligence officer for that 509th group in Roswell, which was the only group at the time who was able to drop the atomic bomb. By the way, this is how sophisticated this group was and how trusted they were. That's Jesse Marcel, and he goes out, Major Marcel, and he goes to look at the debris, and he says, we've never seen anything like this. It's definitely not one of ours. Now, it's come up in really good people, good researchers have done the work saying that this could have been a German craft, although it's 2 years after we defeated the Germans in the war, so it would seem unlikely. But there are some authors out there, for example, Dr. Joseph Farrell, we've had in this program many times, who's written books like Roswell and the Reich, where a post-Nazi group continues to work with this kind of UFO advanced X technology, and they set up their own little launching places from, say, South America, and they come over here and they do surveillance and then they get out, and that this was one of them. There's so much alien lore around the crash. That is, there's witnesses like Frankie Rowe, whose dad was a fireman, and she remembers the incident very well. She's not with us anymore either, because the incident, after all, happened in 1947. Now, I want to mention something about the Roswell incident, which is we wouldn't know anything about it. It just so happens that it was reported at the time in the Roswell Daily Record, and they thought that they'd found a UFO. And that's how it was reported. And it was the base itself that had reported that after they couldn't identify the footage. They suppressed the story very quickly. But before they got to suppress it, Major Marcel went out to the Roswell Ranch to look at the debris. And he, as I said, was very impressed with it. At a certain point, he pulls up these pillars that look like they have hieroglyphs on them. And he said that there was a kind of metal that it had, but you couldn't do anything to it. You couldn't burn it, you couldn't break it, and all the rest. So at a certain point, he's talking to General Ramey, who's commander, and Ramey sets up this whole press conference where he has to deny that he found anything exotic, and they show him with a weather balloon, which is not what he said he found, and years later he would say they staged the photograph. That's the photograph that they flashed to the world at the time. Now, Ramey in that shot is shown down here, and people have taken a lot of interest in that memo that he had because it talks about victims. This is very interesting because it gets us into all the stories like Frankie Rose about alien bodies and all the, aliens that died during the Roswell crash. Now, I'm going to say my opinion right up front is that Roswell was an alien incident, that there's something involved with aliens regarding it. I think that that's been pretty obvious. However, this idea that there's Nazi tech around it and that the presence of certain people would give us the impression that there is a Nazi connection here, I think is very important, and we're going to look at very closely. Now, I want to read a couple of kind of odd and very interesting moments on the record, some testimony, where we get an impression of who might be at that base who we're just don't think of in history as being there at all. Yes, Miss Olivia, what you got?
No, nothing.
Oh, gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
I'm right there with you. By the way, everyone, before I get into this, you're watching the Dark Journalist program, and we are going to be taking questions in the second half of the program, so have them ready. And you can ask them now. Just ask them all in caps. And Miss Olivia is going to put that together for a slamma-jamma second part of the broadcast tonight. This is X Series episode 68. And I want to remind you to go to the Dark Journalist website, sign up for our newsletter. And it's a free newsletter. That's something that's just going to keep us in touch while we are on these various social networks, because frankly, it's getting pretty dicey out there, as I think Gigi would concur, in terms of the types of censorships that we're seeing on the various platforms. So the best way, the strongest way to keep that link is just to go directly to the website and sign up for that free newsletter. And you'll get a newsletter about once a week in your inbox. And you will, you'll get to know about events and things that are coming up. So it's a win-win all around, but that's the only way we can actually guarantee that we're not going to be railroaded by some of the social media networks when they get together at the Davos and the Davos crowd meets up and they say, you know what, let's just pull the plug. So we never know. So I want to make sure that we stay on top of that. All right. This is from a book called Witness to Roswell. There's some Roswell recollections, I think, that are just not paid attention to because there's been so much saturation. And it seemed like, once a year, there's a new Roswell book. But there are some very important things about Roswell, about certain types of accounts from very important or people who can be trusted, good sources, and some of the things that they saw. Here's one. In the summer of 1947, Earl Zimmerman was a re-enlistee working at the Roswell Air Force Base Radio Shack as a high-speed code transmission operator. During off-duty hours, he moonlighted as a bartender at the base officers club. He heard many rumors about the crash of a flying saucer while working at the club and around the base, including something about investigating the discovery of one under the guise of a plane crash. That is, they were saying, it's a plane crash. We're setting it up as a plane crash, but actually it's a crash saucer. Zimmerman remembers at the time of the UFO crash in 1947, seeing General Ramey, the commanding officer of the 8th Air Force in Fort Worth, Texas, to which the 509th Bomb Group in Roswell was attached, in the Roswell Air Force Officers Club on more than one occasion. On several of these occasions, he recalls seeing General Ramey with none other than one of our nation's most beloved national heroes, aviator Charles Lindbergh. Quote, I heard that they were on the base because of the flying saucer business. There was no publicity about Lindbergh's visit, and I was very surprised to see him there. You've got Lindbergh, according to Earl Zimmerman, at the Roswell base. If you do a little bit of research, you'll find that, in fact, Lindbergh was given a security clearance to check aircraft in 1947, a month earlier, and that, in fact, he was stationed at Roswell. Now, there's some interesting dialogue that comes out of this, which is later on, there's someone named Kaufman who he's one of these officers who gave out some good information and some information that seemed overblown. But nonetheless, I'm going to refer to something he said. Well, this is part of the record. In 1947, Lindbergh had been given the task of inspecting the Air Force's strategic bombing capability, which took him into Roswell with a security clearance. There were a number of documents to prove that Lindbergh had been to Roswell more than once. Kaufman always had just enough truth in his details. Now, what's interesting is that at the time, a lot of the Paperclip Nazis that we've brought over here and the scientists are stationed at Wright Air Force Base, which becomes Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, which is where the debris is shipped. Now, according to Kaufman's account, he sees von Braun there with Lindbergh. They're both there for this UFO crash. And their relationship is well established through them both showing up at the Goddard Space Station later at the end of their lives. And it's tracked throughout. As a matter of fact, with the amount of times that Lindbergh goes to Nazi Germany, I think that we're seeing their relationship may have started before we pulled von Braun over as our major father of our rocket program for NASA. So now we have the world's greatest aviation expert, Charles Lindbergh, and the world's greatest rocket expert, von Braun, that we grabbed through the Paperclip program, and who developed the V-2 rockets that bombed London and other places. They're both at Roswell when the crash happens, according to now several sources. So it's undeniable that they were there. The question is, why? They were there to inspect this wreckage. There's a lot of different ways that we can look at this. And when we start to look at the background, Gigi, of Lindbergh, and we see him plugging in very close around the UFO file, and then we see von Braun associated with NASA and with the secret space program and the tussles that Kennedy would have later with NASA. We've got kind of an earthquake here in looking at both of those figures there at the Roswell crash, which has become famous for the first UFO crash on record.
Yeah, I mean, their mysticism too, and I think that leads to like an interest in multidimensionality.
Right.
And some people believe that the Roswell crash was almost pulled in or called in, or that there was some kind of technologies going on that would be kind of considered mystical, but it's just science. And that's kind of where my mind goes.
So there's a portal that's opened up.
Yeah, like that's basically, what I would say. It also just with other things that I've seen psychically around Lindbergh and just around this, that's, what I would say. Yeah.
I mentioned that you did a lot of psychic archaeology for this episode. I didn't get around to asking you why you thought that Lindbergh and von Braun were at the base.
At Roswell?
Yes.
Well, this is just, I'll just give it to you straight.
Yes.
I think that Lindbergh was considered to be of a valuable and of a very special bloodline.
Mm-hmm.
And what I saw was that some people have an endocrine system, not just a blood, but like an endocrine system that is Atlantean. It's an Atlantean endocrine system. It produces a type of kind of cosmic radiation, and the fluids are of a different quality. if you have a materialistic mind, this isn't for you. I'm talking about frequencies that are so subtle, radiation that's so subtle, energy that's so subtle, but does react to crystals and does react to certain things. And I believe that Lindbergh was one of probably the Hemingways as well. There's certain lines that have this endocrine system, either through selective breeding or through hybridization with these beings that still goes on, things like that. And I think they can work the technologies. And I think that that's how we have to start thinking even about World War II, is more about these special bloodlines. And that's really what Hitler was looking at. He was looking for and trying to breed these special bloodlines, or people that had an endocrine system that could use technology like this and that could do certain things. And that's what I would say. I went pretty deep there, but yeah, that's
hey,
what
listen, you ask a good question, you get a good answer. That's
what I saw. Like, you know, I believe, and that's why there's certain image. That's why he was given the opportunities that he was, and so I think, I mean, this isn't what I believe. This is what they made these decisions based on their beliefs and their interpretations of things, but I believe the technology doesn't work for everybody. And I think if you look at Atlantis and the advancement, that the technology was very succinct. And you get to a point where you find these ships, entombed ships, or these ships, and not everybody can use them. Well, why can some people work them and some people can't? And then, you know, you start to get into, well, we better, you start realizing that maybe the most powerful thing to do is to work this advanced technology. It starts getting into that, and also hiding the truth. And that's how all of these things, in my opinion, that's what they stem from.
Wow, Gigi, that's really getting into it. And when I think about Hitler and his own obsessions with Atlantis and how they developed an actual ancestral program to go searching for Atlantis, and they search in Tibet, and they search through Europe, and they even search in Central America at a certain point in the 30s when they're still friendly with us. So that's Nazis in the hot zone, I guess, when you think of it that way. But it's fascinating when you put it on that level, because these people are incorporating that type of occult information into the operations of state, into their geopolitics. And that's one thing we come to again and again when we're dealing with the UFO file, or you're dealing with the hot zone ruins, which are those ruins between Bimini, Cuba, and Yucatan. And we're going to find that there's a whole Yucatan section that actually you introduced me to because you were looking into the archaeology around Lindbergh, which I found absolutely fascinating. And I'm glad that you brought that in, because it's really going to make this whole picture come alive. I do find it interesting that you're saying that these are special people and that they regard them specially. I think of it as, you know, if you were going to have someone, for example, if you had a crashed saucer and you were re-engineering the UFO, not all the pilots, is what you're saying, would be able to just go in there and pilot that. It might fry them. It might do a number of things. There are certain individuals who might have a shot at being able to pilot a UFO, for example.
That's what I saw, and the way that I saw it is kind of like these golden threads. And when you start using the technology, it really matters. They're very delicate, and you have to be able to read them very quickly. It's almost like a psychic synaptic thing, and either it's there or it's not, and either it animates or it doesn't animate. If it doesn't animate, it goes out of control and there's no precision. And then if it is there, you have more precision. That's just how I saw it. That's just how I saw it. So,
oh, it's really, really interesting. There's a lot of UFO lore around pilots attempting to fly UFO technology with very dangerous results, like the Philadelphia experiment type results, where these people disappear or they become basically deranged from having interacted with it this way. one of the people that has been on the circuit for a long time, and recently they came back with a movie about him, is Bob Lazar. And Lazar's story about being at Area 51 and seeing what he calls the sports model UFO has always been very credible to me in some sense, even though there were things that he said about his own background that didn't add up. But there's that story out there, and oddly enough, when he talks about it, and he talks about the UFOs that they had there, he talks about it in terms of what they found doing archaeology, that this was actually an old craft that they had found sort of buried in the desert and taken to do examinations with. This is the kind of entombed UFO idea that you're referencing here.
That was one of the things that I saw just when we were going over the show and I was just sketching my impressions. It was like within the first 10 minutes of when you were going over your discoveries. And I was like, I just keep seeing this. It was basically dug out of the ground, and it had some kind of stone on either side that were like blocks. And then there was a craft in it, and it was kind of like tilted over like that. And the top of it had the same kind of stone, but it was really thick, and you could kind of like slide it over like that. Right. And then it would be there. But it was definitely specifically entombed with some kind of stone or some kind of mineral that I think would have maybe hidden I don't know. I'm not a geologist, but something that was neutralizing it, or was definitely specifically, it was like it was a garage or something. But it was entombed. I saw them as being entombed. And I didn't really know that Bob, I don't know, did he describe them as entombed or just found on an archaeological dig?
Well, it's interesting because he talked about the entryways that Area 51 has through mountains. And so it would look just like a natural feature, and then it would open up and it's actually a door. But in terms of the archaeology and how they found the UFO, I don't know that he's given out those kinds of details. It'd be interesting to see if he would talk about it more in depth. I do find it interesting that we're talking about, everyone thinks, well, they captured a live saucer that was going around and they were doing examinations on it. And then we think about it, actually, no, this thing was ancient, potentially. And it was actually archaeology where they found it. That kind of gives us a different type of ring to this, which is, of course, if we assume that there are crashes in the Roswell Desert in 1947 of these off-world civilizations visiting here, it must have happened also a long time ago.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow, incredible. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist program. We're on X episode 68. We're going to be taking your questions in the second half of the program as well. And Miss Olivia?
Just a quick one. So Najat Madri wanted to know, can people like Lindbergh be direct descendants of the Atlanteans?
You got it.
Yeah.
Got it, Najat.
It is. Gigi, do you want to elaborate?
Yeah, that's what I think it is. And now it gets a little bit, for me, it gets a little bit strange because obviously Atlantis fell a long time ago, and that's quite a lot of proliferation that's going to take place genetically. So I think we have maybe other things going on as well to mitigate that.
Yes.
I would say, but that's exactly, the words that I psychically heard is that the Atlantean endocrine system is different. And it allows a different, you might not notice it by looking, but when it comes to interfacing with psychic stuff, it's very sensitive. And that makes sense because if these technologies are left over from Atlantis, then there may be certain portions of the population that use them easier, or that makes sense.
Wow, fascinating. Absolutely.
Are you going to go into what you think the craft actually was?
That craft?
Mm-hmm.
We have a few crafts, but yeah.
Okay. Larry Jackson wanted to know, do you think what crashed at Roswell was a Horton-designed Nazi flying machine?
That actually does come up. So you're going to be happy before we're done here. Let's take a look at some interesting people. Let's just call this segment "Get to Know Me." When we look at this picture, now we can identify Lindbergh as the tall individual in the middle here. And there's a very interesting group here. However, one person I think who's particularly significant in all this is this person all the way here. And that is Donald Kehoe. Now, Donald Kehoe within the Air Force and was a terrific pilot. And he was the co-pilot and the person who accompanied Lindbergh on his Goodwill tour after the Spirit of St. Louis run for 2 years. And they had a very close relationship going through all these cities in America and around the world. Now, Kehoe wrote a book about his experiences called Flying with Lindbergh, all about the years spent flying with him. Kehoe turns up later in a very interesting, and again, we're going to see now the crisscross from the UFO file directly into Lindbergh's strata. So Kehoe's quote here is, "During my long investigation of these strange objects, I've seen many reports verified by Air Force intelligence, detailed accounts by Air Force pilots, radar operators, and other trained observers proving the UFOs are high-speed craft superior to anything built on Earth." Major Kehoe became the point man for UFO disclosure in the 1950s. Now, we know that just previous to the Roswell incident, Kenneth Arnold was a pilot over Mount Rainier in Washington, and he described these unusual objects as saucers. That's where we got the term flying saucer. This is what he saw, and he saw a fleet of them. That was in late June, and then July 4th, we have the Roswell crash. So there is some logic to thinking, okay, they were up there in Washington, they came down the coast, and they swooped over to where New Mexico is. Now, interestingly enough, probably because of his background, Kehoe became the target of the Air Force because he was saying, well, you're hiding these things about UFOs, etc. And so Lindbergh had to be kind of like, I can't deal with you because, you know, you're getting into a lot of public controversy. And he didn't back him up on his UFO work. So he would face a very hostile media, and he stood by his work, and he also collected 300 pilots to go on the record about UFOs. You know, it's so funny when we talk about the modern CIA takeover of the UFO file and the TTSA and Tom DeLonge and all that. And they had a financial scandal thing kick in today where they paid Tom DeLonge, the company pays him, his own company pays him $35,000 for this material he says is from a UFO. So it starts to look like a lot of sketchy activity. But it's very interesting to me because those groups try to use pilots in the same way. This is work that comes from Kehoe all the way back to the 50s. We had those accounts on record. And, you know, we've had those accounts from Navy pilots. And I think this is very important to point out, which is when the CIA rolls into an area like the UFO file, for example, they try to pretend that they've invented it. And it's very important to look at Kehoe's work. He's already standing up to the Air Force in the 50s. He's Lindbergh's co-pilot. How many UFOs have they seen together where he brings forward these 300 people? And then now when we pull in Lindbergh at Roswell and we have him there with Wernher von Braun, we're starting to see that the UFO file is all over Lindbergh's life. And I think this is significant. And we start to get that impression too that we've been wrestling with this UFO disclosure question for a long time. And when we see ridiculous efforts by the CIA to invent this phony UFO disclosure through TTSA and, you know, create this phony corporation the way that they do in, you know, Bermuda, and just kind of roll it out across the board to try to launder money or whatever it is that they're up to, I think that we have to be very, very wary of elements in the press and the media cooperating with that kind of CIA messing with it. If you really look at the history, you can see that we, conscientious people in the military and good civilian researchers have been looking at this for a long time, and there's over 70 years of research attached to it. To try to wipe out that research to favor a group like the TTSA, locking in with the New York Times and creating phony UFO disclosure is very dangerous. And I highly reject that UFO researchers in the field rejected them and the CIA takeover of the UFO file. Okay, now, Kehoe goes through all this, but he sticks to his guns and he creates an ICAP. And this is a group that will investigate UFOs. And he goes on television and he is talking about this Air Force suppression of the UFO file. And CBS pulls the mic. They just say, this guy's revealing secrets, get him out. I did a little research and I try to find exactly CBS's position on this because it's an extreme move even for that era, moving into the Kennedy era. And so here it is from CBS television. This is the actual letter that they sent about it. I'm going to read it briefly here, just to give us some idea of the things that Kehoe went through when they pulled his mic on live television. This refers to your letter on January 23rd regarding the Armstrong Circle Theater's UFO program, which aired on CBS television networks January 22nd. This program has been carefully cleared for security reasons. Therefore, it was the responsibility of this network to ensure performance in accordance with predetermined security standards. Any indication that there would be a deviation might lead to statements that neither this network nor the individuals on the program were authorized to release. As a consequence, public interest was served by the action taken at CBS in deleting the audio of Major Kehoe's speech at a point where he apparently was about to deviate from the script. So they were really worried about this guy as a loose cannon revealing things that he knew. That Kehoe became the key point person for the UFO file and was Lindbergh's co-pilot for so many years and wrote books about being with him, has us again, Lindbergh, deep in the soup of the UFO file. But I think it's important to look at the amount of flack that Kehoe took as well. So let's look at another Lindbergh UFO tie so that we find ourselves again, Lindbergh in the heart of the UFO file, in the Roswell incident now, with Kehoe now. He's deep in there. And I have to say, whenever we've looked at different UFO researchers taking a look at the history of things, I have never heard one mention anything about Charles Lindbergh. And I've read a lot of them and I know a lot of them. Lindbergh is not on the radar, but here he is deep, deep in the soup. And the way we can get to him deep, deep in the soup is by finding earlier references to people who just kind of put these comments together. And then we're starting to see, we're putting connecting the dots on this. Charles Lindbergh on Carl Jung. Yes, the Swiss psychiatrist comes in here. Jungian psychology has been so important to giving us an alternative look at beyond Freudian. And we have so many things to thank his work for, dream work, synchronicities, so many things that he has added to our vocabulary on this. And I think that Jung, when the 40s and 50s showed up in the UFO wave there, he wanted to understand what was going on. And it's very interesting, the conclusions that he came to. So what happens is that our friend Lindbergh decides, I'm going to go visit Carl Jung. But what are they going to discuss? Well, you guessed it. They're going to discuss UFOs, interestingly enough. Okay. Quote, in the summer of 1959, Charles A. Lindbergh and his wife Anne Morrow Lindbergh were spending their vacation in Switzerland. They went to see Mrs. Lindbergh's publishers, Kurt and Helen Wolf, who were residing at the time in Zurich. Wolf had persuaded Jung to work with Amelia Yaffe on the composition of his autobiography, and Wolf saw Jung from time to time in order to discuss the work in progress. On August 2nd, the Wolfs visited the Lindberghs, and they invited them to go along with them to a visit to Jung at his Bollingen retreat. In a letter, December 11th, to Helen Wolff, Lindbergh set down his recollection of the visit. This was also going to be included in an unfinished autobiography, but it does show up, and it definitely is from Lindbergh. Jung had become interested in the phenomena of flying saucers or unidentified flying objects. In the early 1950s, he had replied to written questions by George Gerster on the subject in 1954 and published his own book in 1958. In a statement that Jung issued to United Press International in August 58, after the report had been spread by the press that he believed UFOs to be physically real, Jung stated, "I cannot commit myself on the question of the physical reality or unreality of the UFOs since I do not possess sufficient evidence either for or against. I therefore concern myself solely on the psychological aspect of the phenomena." That's what we would expect from Carl Jung. But watch how this goes. Now, Lindbergh says, quote, "I looked forward especially to the possibility of listening to Jung talk about flying saucers, for I knew he was deeply interested in them. I recall Jung talking about the depths of the lake at our side and relating the depths to the human subconscious. We were sitting together in a small room, you, Kurt, Jung, Ann, and I. Finally, the conversation shifted to flying saucers. I had expected a fascinating discussion about the psychological aspects of the numerous and recurring flying saucer reports." And again, this is Lindbergh talking about meeting Jung. "To my astonishment, I found that Jung accepted flying saucers as factual. On the one hand, he didn't seem the least interested in the psychological aspects. On the other, he didn't seem at all interested in factual information relating to the investigation of flying saucer reports. When I told Jung that about the UFO reports, he asked me how I accounted for recent flying saucer reports in Europe, especially a series of sightings along an apparently straight line in a flying saucer flight. He referred to Donald Kehoe's book." Remember, this is Lindbergh talking about his friend Donald Kehoe here. "He referred to Donald Kehoe's book about flying saucers. I told Jung that while I had not seen Kehoe in recent years, I knew him intimately many years ago. They were very good friends." And then he says some things here about Kehoe. "We had gone across the United States together in the spirit of St. Louis under the auspices of the Daniel Guggenheim Fund for the Promotion of Aeronautics. He and I usually occupied the same suite of rooms at the hotel where I stopped." So they're tight friends all the way through that period. So he goes on to say here in summation that Kehoe was talking all about these UFOs, and he was basically trying to get out of Jung his impression. "I said that I had been in close contact with de Havilland Company and its engineers at the time because Pan American Airways had on order an option a number of comets, and I was a consultant." So they go on and they have this discussion, and what happens as he says, "I also mentioned to Jung the high-level Pentagon conference cited by Donald Kehoe in the early chapters of the book to substantiate his claims about the reality of flying saucers. Kehoe wrote that his conference had been called because of the alarm caused by flying saucers and their sighting, and that it was highly secret, and that the officials attending the conference felt the situation was so alarming and serious that the information discussed should be withheld from public knowledge." Now, it's very interesting because when we look at this whole setup, later Kehoe will say that he meets with Lindbergh and that Lindbergh won't give him the time of day on the UFO file. And someone asks him later their opinion, and he says he knows about the UFO file, but he's not going to say anything about it, basically. But we can see in this whole back and forth that it resolves in Jung basically saying that, of course, there's a reality to UFOs. And with Lindbergh being stunned by all this. So here's Lindbergh on the record talking with Carl Jung, probably the most important psychological force in the 20th century. And Jung is saying, from his perspective, psychologically and all the rest of it, yeah, that's one thing, but I actually believe, just based on the reports, that the flying saucers are real. And Lindbergh is stunned because he's gone there expecting him just to kind of give him this idea that, well, we're manifesting these UFOs because it's part of our consciousness. I found this particularly enlightening. And now we're looking at the third thread of the UFO file with Lindbergh. Gigi, it's starting to look undeniable that he had a lifelong association with the UFO file.
Yeah, I think that he did. I think there's no question. I think that his role in the UFO file wasn't as a mechanic or, something like a Bob Lazar. I think that his role in the UFO file was perhaps the most secret part of the UFO file, the most guarded.
Yes.
And perhaps one of the reasons why World War II even came to pass in the way that it did. And that's why there's no associations, because if you start digging around Lindbergh, you may start asking the wrong questions. So I don't think he had the traditional role that people would associate with someone. I think he had an esoteric role.
Absolutely. I mean, it's amazing, right? Because you hear these stories like, Jimmy Carter saw a UFO and reported it. And whenever you get around the UFO community and the reporting around it, you'll have these people that they take out, like Jackie Gleason saw dead aliens, or Jimmy Carter saw a UFO. You never hear Lindbergh. I have never heard Lindbergh associated with the UFO file. And here,
especially Roswell Crash, like he was at Roswell. Like there's so many, just no one says anything.
How do you protect that kind of a legacy from a figure that's that famous? It's quite remarkable.
I think we have to go a little bit deeper, and I think we have to look at, well, what if the role that he was playing was such that they didn't want people to start looking around at that? And so we better just keep that whole thing a secret because it's so valuable to us, that we got to let that out.
So can I just
ask
Gigi?
Yeah.
So in your psychic reading on the subject, have you, although I'm sure you leave room for adjusting it, what is your impression? Because it sounds like you think he is almost the center of the wheel, that he is that crucial of the UFO file.
I think that he is in a way. I think the UFO file is huge, and I think it spans a long period of time, and I think it incorporates a lot of different things. But I think that his role is big because I think that the technology, I think that people who had access to these crafts that were entombed, these archaeological digs, and they found these crafts. I think that people realize that they don't run like on combustion engines. They don't run like we think they do. And oh my gosh, why can some people fly this thing a little bit better than others? Like, what's going on? And they're going through this process of figuring out how to use this strange technology. And I think you start to figure it out. And so that's a part of the UFO file that if this is the most superior technology that you have, and let's say it's a crystal technology, like we've talked about the 2i, so let's say it's run on that. Yeah. If this is the most superior technology that we can possibly have on this planet, then wouldn't you want to control how exactly it worked? Wouldn't you want to maybe breed people that you thought could use it so you could control it? You start to think a little bit differently about and you'd want to protect that truth so strongly because that's the ultimate control.
Right. And he's sort of at a cross section of two mysteries, sort of human potential and ancestry with the bloodlines and the UFO technology.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think you're getting there now. You're getting there now. And this is what Gigi is introducing here, which is that it's not just a story of, hey, he was behind the scenes and knew about UFOs. It's that he somehow is one of those keys to working with them.
Yes, and we've heard stories like this before about people, you know, soldiers coming through with a very disheveled look on their face, like, yeah, we don't really know how these things work. They seem to work for some people. You have to go into this meditative state. You have to do this, and they're disturbed. A lot of the people, and you hear about these things, but you just kind of got to put it together a little bit, and you merge it with Atlantis, maybe merge it with Hitler's incessant breeding of certain people that he believed to be measuring their faces, and it's just kind of like you start to be like, okay, well maybe that's why you'd go to Tibet and try to find all these. Yeah, you kind of think that.
It's funny because I'm just going into the Hitler section, actually.
Great.
Good old Hitler. What we're going to do, actually, is we're going to take a quick look here at Lindbergh's grandfather. And Miss Olivia, I'm actually curious, as I have these here. These are great, but it doesn't look like I have the Yucatan temple shot from overhead, which I think might still be on the desk.
Is it possibly over here?
Nope.
Okay.
No, it would be
I'll check.
it would be with them, but let's see if it's there. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist program. We're on episode X68. This is Lindbergh now, the Lindbergh Roswell UFO mystery, and this is Charles Lindbergh and his association with the Aerial Archaeology and the kind of secret society mystery school background of his family, then with the UFO file, then trying to be recruited by the Nazis. And we have some very interesting quotes and comments later in life that come up for Lindbergh. And one of them is this, which is, quote, this is from the New York Times in 1970. Oh, excellent. Those are exactly what I wanted. Yes. Yeah, fantastic.
Okay.
You hit the mother load. Let's see, where would we be without Olivia? There we go.
We'd be lost.
Nowhere fast. Here's the quote. Lindbergh says, U.S. lost World War II.
Who said that?
Lindbergh, New York Times, 1970. This is a picture of him getting an award, actually. That's Hermann Goering, and this is Lindbergh here. And they just stuck a picture of Hitler down there just before he mentioned Gigi. And he goes on, Charles Lindbergh, who was one of America's leading opponents of entry into World War II, that's true. And he led something called America First. Sound familiar? Trump's America First, of course. They got a good title there. But Lindbergh gets this rap. It's like, well, he must have been a fascist and all the rest of it. And because he opposed going into war, I want to point out that as soon as we were attacked during Pearl Harbor, he joined the war effort. But he was part of a number of isolationists in America who did not want us getting involved in the European wars and saw it really as basically armaments makers preparing to make a really large amount of money by turning the world into a gigantic military zone. And unfortunately, it turned out to be true. Now, there's a lot of reasons for us to have got into World War II, and certainly the number of dynamics that were going on there, but you can see the desire in the late 1930s, 1940, to stay out of the European wars. And this is what Lindbergh is representing. But so what they say is Charles Lindbergh, who was one of America's leading opponents of entry into World War II, still believes that he was right in urging the country to stay out of the conflict. Indeed, he contends that the United States, in the perspective of the last 30 years, lost the war. It's a very interesting statement for an American hero. And, they go on and they analyze the things that he says, but in fact, he put it on the record, and he kept a journal of the complete years of World War II. And although he had a lot of problems with FDR because he was an isolationist and he thought that FDR was getting us into the war casually, they had a lot of animosity, and he supported opposition candidates. But when he tried to re-enlist, FDR actually stopped him. And so he went around through channels and joined a contractor agency that could fly pilots, and he did fly fighter missions in World War II anyway. So this is somebody who, again, when it was faced with it, he wanted to do it, but he was trying very hard to keep us out of the war.
So when he was asked to explain that comment, what did he say?
Well, he said, it goes pretty deep, and it'll kind of take us off script for what we're doing, but I will say this.
Does he reference the deep state at all?
No, I think in essence, what he's saying is that there was another way to handle the situation, and that, through international pressure or whatever it was. But he's saying that we lost elements of the culture in World War II. And he's talking definitely the same way that Eisenhower is talking about the military-industrial complex taking over. And so, basically everything becomes about warfare after that. So if you're somebody
That's for sure.
who lived before World War II, and then there you are in 1970, and you're in Vietnam and all these other things, you're thinking, well, the world has become incredibly militarized.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess if you're looking before and you're thinking of that mentality of where he came from as a youth in the 20s and 30s, he was familiar with World War I. And it's interesting because his dad was trying to keep America out of World War I. So they have a kind of a lineage of doing this, interestingly enough. So that gives us some idea there. One thing I want to point out here, too, in reference to our friend Lindbergh, is that this is a very interesting line that goes back. So let's take a quick look at it. This person is named Ola Manson. He actually was a member of Swedish Parliament, got involved in a bribery scandal, and he had a wife and 7 children. But he had a mistress, and the mistress was pregnant. And what happened was, as a result of the scandal or something, he flees with the mistress to America. But before he does, Gigi changes his name to August Lindbergh. His actual name is Ola Manson. And the son that he has in America, he'll call Charles August Lindbergh. That son will have a son who will fly the Spirit of St. Louis, and his name will be Charles Augustus Lindbergh. Here we go with August again.
Here we go.
It's August and October.
It's August and October. And yeah, they're using the name just like Aldrin's mother was named Moon. They're using the names in a magical way.
Yes. We're getting that sense as we do it. Now, August Lindbergh will become Charles Lindbergh, Charles August Lindbergh, and that's his son there, who is what we know as Lucky Lindy there, Charles Lindbergh. Interestingly enough, of course, Charles Lindbergh will have a son himself, who he will call Charles Augustus Lindbergh. It was basically Charles Augustus Lindbergh IV, and we know that he will be kidnapped and die tragically at an early age. And that's going to bring in figures like Edgar Cayce, and we're going to start to see interesting connections here. But one thing I want to point out about the family is that his dad is a member of Congress, a very prominent member of Congress, runs for the Senate to try to get us out of World War I before we go in, and writes a book repudiating the Federal Reserve. Very interesting political views coming over here and establishing himself, being one generation away from an immigrant. Quite fascinating. Another lifelong association I want to plant in people's minds when we think about Lindbergh is his lifelong association with the Kennedys and friendship with John Kennedy, President Kennedy. He was close friends with Kennedy's dad in the 30s. And there are a series of letters between him and Kennedy's dad that show this friendship. And then we also see Lindbergh very close with Joe Kennedy, who is the older brother of John Kennedy, who will blow up in a plane crash. He was the one that Kennedy's dad wanted to see become president before John, actually. And that's what he was counting on. So it's through that happening that John becomes the one that becomes the focus to become president. But this close line, again, we have the Hemingways close in with the Kennedys, and that whole thing that takes place where Mary Hemingway smuggles the vault out of Cuba. Now we have the Lindberghs very close with the Kennedys and very close around archaeology and around the UFO file. We're starting to see what you're talking about there, which is those lines coming together.
Yeah, it's really interesting because we didn't obviously plan this. Like it's,
just so happens.
Yeah, they're all coming up. They're all around that Atlantis area. They're all around and interested in the UFO file. The moon, Kennedy obviously is the space president. He was all about the moon, you know, so it's all there.
We choose to go to the moon. And we do these things not because they are easy, but because they're hard. Lindbergh is a UFO pilot. This really interested me, and I did a little research, and I found that Lindbergh liked to do high altitude tests himself. And when they said, well, you know, you're a precious human American treasure, you can't do this kind of stuff, Lindbergh would say, no, I don't want a double. I don't want a stunt person to go in there. I want to do it. And here he is in one of those experiments. This is a hardcore guy, Gigi. Something interesting is going on here. He's testing himself to the limit. And he also is quite fascinated with eugenics. This is leading to part of what you're talking about, which is when we speak about this kind of Superman quality, it's a quality that is sought after in those circles.
Yeah, it would be. It'd be very valuable, you know, in those circles, because if you can, whoever can use that technology has the power and has the influence.
Right.
So, and maybe it's not just who can use the technology, but who can use it the best, and maybe doing the high altitude tests and exposing yourself to, and maybe his flight. I mean, maybe, you know, maybe his flight in the Spirit of St. Louis was proof that he could use his intuition and hone his intuition. Maybe that's all part of it too.
Yes.
You know, kind of changes how we look at it a little bit if we consider the UFO element.
Well, he's incredibly young. 25 for that transatlantic flight is remarkable. I do find that when we're looking at Lindbergh over and over again, these aspects of Superman come up. Later in life, when he will have a kind of a double life, living in Germany and having a family that's secret, they will know him as Care or Carew Kent, Careu. This is the pseudonym that he used with them, saying that he was a special writer and that the family had to keep it under wraps. They couldn't let this information out. A lot of that Care Kent, when looking at it, I went back to Clark Kent and Superman, thinking of this Superman aspect. And when I did, I found very interesting things about his best friends, including his best friend, Buzz Aldrin's dad, who we're going to get into in a moment here. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist program. This is episode X68, and this is Lindbergh's flight into Roswell to take part in the UFO mystery with Wernher von Braun. And we're going to find something else very spooky and very interesting along the lines of Lindbergh in Roswell in a moment here. I want to remind everyone to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. That's a free newsletter that keeps you in the loop with all the amazing shows that we have coming up. And this is going to be a very important season here coming in with the fall. We're going to have very important breakthrough guests and breakthrough shows for you. You do not want to miss them. Make sure you're on that mailing list. While you're there, sign up for Dark Journalists, subscribe to the show, support the show, get behind our efforts here. You know, it's very important. any kind of contribution, of course, is welcome to the show. But subscribing to the show is important because it's that ongoing sort of key support that is so reliable.
Yeah,
And,
well, I mean, you can feel like a patron of the show, right? You know,
Yes.
you're making it happen.
right, and you don't even have to be a Patreon. You just- we make it very simple. You go to the website and you go to subscribe. The subscribe link is right there. And we've made it very affordable. I've kept it, what is it, $5 a month?
Yep.
I mean, it's remarkable. So, because we want everyone on board as much as possible. But I would say that it's important, you know, this is a good time to get behind the efforts of the work that we're doing here on the show. So I highly encourage that. And I also want to mention in relation to Gigi's work that she has a new course coming out for November. And this sounds very exciting. Gigi, you've gone through 2 incredible courses in psychic development and intuitive development. What can you tell us about this one?
Yeah, so this one's going to be actually about the energy body and the chakra system, but it's not just going to be about that. It's also going to go a little bit cosmic. So I'm going to include the 8th chakra. I'm going to include the notion of etheric bodies and remerging with etheric bodies and things like that. So it's not just any chakra course or energy course. It's going to be through a bit of a different lens. And so that's what it'll be around in November. So you can sign up actually now for pre-notification, and it's just my website /new course.
So let's give that out again. So it's gigiyoung.com/new course.
Yes.
Yes. And this one sounds very exciting. I talk to people all the time, Gigi, who've taken your courses, and it's amazing the kind of results that they get from that in opening up to this. And what I think is interesting about it is how would somebody approach, you know, developing their intuition, and, you know, what are the tools involved? So I like that you've set it up this way, in that it's sort of like beginning, intermediate, advanced. This is something that somebody can test out. They can sort of test run and see if it's something that works for them. I've heard extraordinary things about it.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah, people have good results, and I talk to you, like we do a live Q&A. There's forums you can join and talk to other students, and it's kind of like a community as well. So yeah, it's great.
Fantastic. I'm fond of saying that, Gigi, there's no better friend or ally to the X series, because I work so much with Gigi on these key issues. And on this episode in particular, Gigi, I think we worked the closest of any of them so far.
Yeah, stuff was just flying, and I had a hard time keeping up with it, actually. I had to like cut it off, like, you know.
At a certain point, we were like, hey, you know, Vulcan, we're doing the Vulcan evolution. It was like,
it was, well, that's sometimes how things come in, and when it rains, it pours. and then it'll be quiet for a while. But when it pours, you got to get it all in, because sometimes there's like, it's for the future, sometimes for now. It's,
yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, it's interesting linking back when we come to Lindbergh and Roswell, and let's try this one on. Let's take a good look at, and remember the Clark Kent thing, because this is going to help us a lot in this section. This is a picture here of Lindbergh, and he is in Roswell.
Oh, a giant.
He is very tall.
How tall is he?
He's actually 6'4". Yeah. But it is remarkable. The people that he's with are very interesting, and where he is interesting. Olivia, where do you think he is?
No idea.
He is in Roswell, New Mexico. But the year is 1934, some 13 years before the Roswell crash. And what's happened is he's convinced this man, Daniel Guggenheim, to support this man, Robert Goddard, in his rocket activity in 1934. And there they are in the land that they buy in Roswell, 13 years before the incident. So they do rocket tests, and Goddard is there. Robert Goddard will become known as basically the father of our rocket program here in the United States. I know Jack Parsons gets brought up a lot in that regard, and deservedly so, but Jack Parsons was more on the Crowley side, and I would say, from what I know about Goddard, he wasn't into black magic. Although he might have been using some magic for sure. this is Goddard out there in some very interesting desert in New Mexico, Roswell, New Mexico, putting together his rockets. And I think what we're seeing here is the association around Roswell as a center long before the UFO crash shows up. And we have individuals like Lindbergh and like Goddard there. And it is, in fact, Lindbergh that gets him there. But who was it who got Lindbergh to get him there? And this is where Buzz Aldrin's dad comes in. This is a very important section. Buzz Aldrin's dad, he went, and so did Goddard, to a university here in Massachusetts called Clark. And whenever I was going through that Carew Kent, it was Clark over and over again that was coming up. And I think this reference, I guess calling himself Clark Kent would have been pretty obvious. But Carew Kent is very interesting because it's C-A-R-U, which is 5 letters, just like Clark. And the word care is in there, which I also found interesting. But let's learn a little bit about his best friend, Edwin Eugene Aldrin Sr., Buzz Aldrin's dad. He was an aviator and officer in the United States Army during World War I and World War II. He was assistant commandant of the Army's first test pilot school at McCook Field, Ohio, from 1919 to 1922. Later became the Air Force Institute of Technology at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. This is crucial. Again, we have a Wright-Patterson connection coming up in relation to Lindbergh and coming up in relation to the UFO file. The Edwin E. Aldrin Sr. Award is presented at the Air Force Institute of Technology for leadership in accomplishing educational objectives. He's the father of astronaut Buzz Aldrin, who we touched on earlier. He's born in Worcester, Mass, April 12, 1896. He was educated at Clark University, as I mentioned. One thing I think it's important, at Clark, he studied rocketry under Robert Goddard. Now, through his friendship with Lindbergh, Edwins, he convinces Lindbergh, this guy's doing rockets, you're interested in this. They get together. Lindbergh goes to his good friend, Guggenheim, and says, we need money for this, for the Roswell rockets. Put it together. Guggenheim comes up with $5 million. That's a lot of money back then. That's like 50 million now, basically. Quite interesting. So he goes through World War I and all the rest of it. And I think in looking at his history, Aldrin's, we see this close association with MIT, as we see it with Goddard also. He's awarded an aeronautical engineering degree in 1918, writing his thesis on, quote, the investigation of behavior of electrically heated wires with varying inclination to wind stream as applied to anemometer development. And then he is somebody who is working with someone named Arthur Keneally. Arthur Keneally will become the, his proteges will be Buzz Aldrin's dad, Edwin, and also Vannevar Bush, who will take over at MIT and be the leader of the Rad Lab. So we're starting to see these threads going back a little bit earlier. And so there's so many interesting things on and off about his life. But what I find particularly interesting is that he goes on to work for Standard Oil and for Rockefeller in the 30s. But before he does, I want to suggest something quite unique here. In the middle of all this, he decides, I'm going to be a stockbroker. And, okay, it's the roaring 20s, you're going to be a stockbroker. Great. And he's apparently a very good one. But he gets a very interesting tip. And the tip says, sell all your stocks in August, 2 months before the crash in October. So he does. And he does very well. When the crash goes down, he's got tons of money. He's all set. Now, interestingly enough, another figure that comes into this, who'll come into Lindbergh's life, Edgar Cayce, who is giving many readings at the time for Wall Street people like Morton Blumenthal. And what will happen here, which I think is very interesting and which I have been attempting to nail down, which is, I believe that Aldrin's dad is part of the group that goes to Cayce for readings regarding Bimini. And I'll tell you why. During the Lindbergh baby kidnapping, they say a close friend of Lindbergh goes to Edgar Cayce. Now we know his best friend is listed as Buzz Aldrin's dad. He goes, this person goes to Cayce and says, can you give us reading on this very unusual kidnapping? And Cayce, you know, he goes for working with these people behind the scenes often. But he says, don't publicize my role. Basically, I'll give you the information that you want. Now, one of the people who was Cayce's conduit to this New York Wall Street world is someone named Dave Kahn. And he's in the car there pictured. I guess I should show him again. There's Dave Kahn, who wrote a very interesting book about Cayce years later and how Wall Street traders sought him out often. But one of the things that he says to Kahn, almost mystically, is he tells him to reach out to President Roosevelt's wife and Secretary of the Treasury named Morgenthau. During a reading, he gives him this information. So he goes there and he does it, and Kahn gets signed up for this meeting. Now, Kahn is someone who knows Cayce, and I'm suggesting here that this is related to Lindbergh and how Lindbergh gets to work with Cayce on finding his child. So I just want to read this briefly. What Kahn says is, I was ushered into one office where a colonel in charge had obviously been briefed that I was a troubleshooter who seemed to know how to get whatever was in critically short supply. The colonel said he'd been instructed to put me into the quartz crystal business. I didn't know what the quartz crystal business was. He explained that it was an extremely important device used in submarines and other vital instrumentation. The job that Kahn got was to fill an order for 8 million polished and cut crystals within a matter of weeks, what almost seemed an impossible assignment. Dave Kahn goes on to explain that he had this almost kind of mystical reading from Cayce that put him in touch with all these situations, and he winds up becoming the major import-exporter for quartz crystal for the war effort. Now, Kahn puts Cayce in touch with people like Morton Blumenthal, who's this Wall Street, and they help build the ARE, and he gives them readings, and there's a lot of very interesting things happen there. Eventually, they pull out during the Depression, and they leave Cayce high and dry, and his hospital closes and all the rest of it. This happened to Cayce several times. But then we have this figure in the middle between Lindbergh and Cayce. Now, this figure is described as a close friend of Lindbergh's. And his best friend is Edwin Buzz Aldrin's dad. So, on the idea that these are one and the same people, let's take a quick look at the readings given for Lindbergh, very briefly. And this is quite an interesting connection here, because I think we're starting to see that Cayce comes into Lindbergh's life, and here we have now the Mystery School plug-in directly. So they ask, during the questioning of Cayce from the friend, they ask him, give us readings on the child that's been kidnapped. And we have to remember something about the Lindbergh kidnapping also, which is that it really dominated every newspaper. It was the biggest story anywhere. He was an American hero. Someone threw a ladder, came up and snatched his child, and then demanded a ransom and all the rest of it. It was quite unusual. Some of the strange facts that came out during Cayce's reading is that the child had his hair cut and dyed, which was interesting, Gigi, because you suggested that had some kind of an occult significance, which I thought was very much on target. But, so the following suggestion was given to Edgar Cayce on March 9th, 1932. You'll have before you Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr., who about 7:30 p.m. on March 1st, 1932, was removed. Give the exact location of this body in the present hour, March 9th, 1932. Describe the surest and best way to restore the child unharmed to the parents. So the reading indicates that the child was removed from the bedroom by someone at 8:30 p.m., and another man took the body. There was a third person in the car, and it was further stated that the child was taken to a house in a mill section near New Haven. A section called Cardova was mentioned. Now, Cayce gives some names for streets here for where the child is, and they're unfamiliar to the people. And what they do is they find out a couple of days later that the name of the street has been changed just recently, and that the name that Cayce is giving is the most recent, the new name, and that they're looking at the old name on the maps. Very unusual tuning in that Cayce is doing. Further information was requested when a close friend of Colonel Lindbergh became involved. Cardova was described as related to a manufacturing area, manufacturing leather boots, shoes, saddles, and the like. An entrance to the mills was described in the house located in relation to this description. Adam Street was mentioned in the fact that the numbers and names had been changed. This actually seems to suggest that Cayce was functioning in another time sequence when he was looking at this. So Dave Kahn and Lindbergh's friend, who I believe is Buzz Aldrin's dad, go to the street, they go to the place, and they talk to the city engineer about the name change, and the city engineer tells them the name only changed 2 weeks before, that's why you couldn't find it on the map. So Cayce is seeing past the maps and going into it. Later, Cayce will say that Hopman was kind of more like a patsy or a bagman involved in the whole thing, and that there was a much bigger thing behind it. But they don't find the child in time, and in fact, he does turn up dead. So in Cayce, in the annals of Cayce's work, it's seen as a miss or something where they couldn't locate the child in time. But something very interesting shows up there, which is this connection of Lindbergh with Cayce and the friend in between. Now, there's always been a story about a businessman who, a group of businessmen from Wall Street who come to Cayce to get the readings on the Bimini Wall. And this started to resonate with me when I was looking at the friend of Lindbergh and the Wall Street connection to this. I think that we have here with Buzz Aldrin getting that information, Buzz Aldrin's dad, getting that information about pulling the money out before the crash after he magically becomes a stockbroker in the first place. I think we're looking at a direct relationship there between a friend of Cayce's and a friend of Lindbergh's coming together, and that's how Cayce gets involved with the whole Lindbergh saga. So here we are.
And where does he go to work after the crash? I forget. When he
after the
takes
stock market crash.
yeah.
He goes to work for Standard Oil for the Rockefellers, interestingly enough. And then he makes his home, and Buzz Aldrin's home, Miami. So right in the HotZone. Found all that very terribly interesting. And I think in looking at the kind of psychic aspect that Lindbergh comes from in his own, even in the spirit of St. Louis, the idea of him working with Cayce on this was very intriguing. But the idea of that intermediary, the close friend there who was familiar with Cayce and with Lindbergh, I couldn't help but think about Buzz Aldrin's dad there.
Yeah.
It is.
They were in the same circles. They had the same interests.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think so. And the Hemingways were getting readings too.
The Hemingways were getting readings, and it was all related to archaeology.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, we can say, let's look at Lindbergh. Why would we think archaeology with Lindbergh? Well, it just so happens Lindbergh was doing archaeology from the air. If you ever get into this, it's quite fascinating because Anne Morrow Lindbergh wrote all kinds of stories about their trips doing aerial archaeology. That's Lindbergh's wife. Charles Lindbergh's little-known passion. This is from the Archaeology Conservancy. In 1927, an obscure U.S. mail pilot named Charles A. Lindbergh completed the first solo transatlantic flight, achieving worldwide fame. Virtually everyone knows about Lucky Lindy's historic flight in the spirit of St. Louis. Lindbergh was also a pioneer in the field of aerial archaeology. And he knew how to look for these ruins from above. Lindbergh's life and aerial archaeological surveys bring to light his efforts to help locate and document lost monuments from the past. Quote, Lindbergh has always had broad and varied interest, and his fame from the 1927 Atlantic flight opened a lot of interest, said Berg, his biographer. His interest in archaeology stems from spotting Mayan ruins in the jungle while flying 1928-1929, scouting possible air routes for Pan American Airways in Yucatan. Dead in the hot zone. Let's take a look at some of the things that he shot up there. That's another one, Pioneering Aerial Archaeology by Charles and Ann Lindbergh. Gigi, you found that one, which I think is quite exceptional. And now we have that whole window on Charles Lindbergh. Let's take a quick look at some of his quite remarkable photography from the sky. That there is the Kukulkan Temple. It's quite a remarkable shot.
Yes,
I would
Chichen-Itza,
say.
right?
Chichen-Itza. We are looking at, take more of these. He's getting the really hardcore pyramid shots around Yucatan.
Who hired him to do this?
Well, it's very interesting because it came about out of his own interest. He's going to the Southwest, and then the Carnegie Foundation opens up and says, we want you to do this aerial photography. And oddly enough, the person who's the head of the Carnegie Foundation is Vannevar Bush. So again, we have that Vannevar Bush overlay coming in with our friend Lindbergh. But clearly, with that kind of aerial archaeology, we're looking at someone who is, let's say, there are more purposes than one to the work that he's doing. And we're starting to see, just like in the case of the Hemingways, this severe interest in archaeology. And Gigi, when we look at the Lindberghs and the August and Augustus, and then we look at the Hemingways and the August Augustus and see them both on the world stage, doing their careers and being famous for their careers, but on the side doing this archaeology, we're looking at a real pattern there.
We absolutely are. And they're very mystical. They go to Cayce. They both go to Cayce for readings. They're all, kind of food guarding Atlantis. They're all hanging out in Atlantis, waiting for something to come up, And
that's a good way to put it.
it's kind of like it's a generational thing. But they're all doing the same sort of, they have different tasks, but they're obviously part of a system of exploration.
Yes. Well, and they're in the hot zone because they're doing the archaeology in the hot zone. They're not over in Europe doing archaeology.
Yeah, Lindbergh was given the key to Havana, Cuba.
Exactly.
They gave him they had this whole ceremony, like ladies dancing, like cigars everywhere. And then here's Lindbergh, he walks up and they give him the key to Havana. So he's over there in Cuba.
Yeah.
So.
Sounds like my next birthday party, actually.
Yeah, it does actually. And like Hemingway has his whole house in Cuba, and like here's Lindbergh's got the key to the city, and it's like. Yes.
And just in case they were missing it, Hemingway just moves into Bimini.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
It's incredible. So we've got the hot zone pouring into the UFO file, and we have the bloodlines coming in to do this. And I have to say that I've always associated, working back from his friends and associations, I've always associated Kehoe with X-Share. And I've always associated, the groups like X-Protect is bumping off guys like Morris Jessup in the UFO file. So, but Hemingway, Kennedy, Lindbergh, these are all ex-share groups. And I do feel like they're manipulated in a sense, because I can see with Lindbergh, they try to make him play both sides by having him work with Braun, etc., who's definitely more as part of the ex-Protect group, part of the Paperclip Nazi enclave that takes over NASA and becomes very secretive and doesn't want Kennedy to share any of the UFO technology with the Russians, and then, you know, sets off all of these processes that happen where by the end of the JFK assassination, the lead investigator, Jim Garrison, says, well, the conspiracy was rested in aerospace. It was the aerospace agencies. So I think when we're looking at these connections and the things that we're weaving together, we've got something now that we didn't have before. We have the understanding that Hemingway, Lindbergh, Kennedy, they're working on this mystery. They're working on the UFO file mystery, and they're working on the HotZone mystery, which relates to Atlantis. So we have them as almost like we can identify them now as deep into these programs. And I do feel like in the case of Hemingway and Lindbergh, they're both manipulated to go to the other side. And I think in the case of Hemingway, they try to force the issue, and that's how his suicide comes up. The same thing with Les Hemingway. I think he's getting close to that, Hemingway's brother. But in Lindbergh's case, I truly think that the Nazis try to recruit him because he is so special, and that the ex-Protect group inside the national security state tries to recruit him because he's special, and that's why he's there in Roswell.
Yeah, he's Clark Kent, you know. Yeah. And it's incredible when you put it all together, because everybody, especially like I think in esoterica and even in the UFO scene, they look at Atlantis and the technology as being so far away, and as not having a narrative today or 50 years ago or 100 years ago or 200 years ago. And I think that one of the most important things to grasp here with Hemingway and Lindbergh and von Braun is that it never stopped. Atlantis fell, but it never stopped.
Right.
And we may not be able to look at it in the same way because it's had many different incarnations for each age. But when we look at these things, it's no longer like a shadow in our mind, Atlantis, or like a metaphysical thing. We can talk about lineages and we can talk about technology, and it becomes more real, which I think is where we need it to be if everything is actually kind of about that.
Right.
So.
Right, absolutely. It has to become an actual experience as opposed to an echo of a story from long ago.
Yeah.
I think we need to understand it. The way that Cayce put it is he talked about it in terms of land rising. This is how the mystery schools put it out. It's land rising. But I guess the metaphor to land rising is consciousness rising.
I think it goes together. And and that's why I think the timing can be challenging, is because, you know, when you're dealing with different etheric layers that make up the physical world, they unlock at certain times, they move. It's like the Mayans knew that everything was sort of like a cosmic clock of different interdimensional gears, and things move and things rise and fall. And so you can't always predict it perfectly. Cayce does a very good job. Yeah. But I think that's why they're guarding it, and everyone's around there, is because they know that we're in for, and I even have some disturbing visions of even false rising. If false risings, if things don't go according to certain people's times and certain people's plans, there are plans for false ones. So we have to be really bring our attention here, and we have to start factoring it in.
Well, I want to mention that the phony CIA TTSA group that's doing the false CIA disclosure now, with Tom DeLonge and as the Bobo and Luis Elizondo as the lead CIA guy, they mentioned Atlantis a couple of weeks ago, almost like they can't get their way on the UFO file if they get exposed too early, that they're going to switch functions and go to Atlantis disclosure.
And yeah. Oh. I was going to just say that
there's steam coming out of my ears.
I know. Leave it alone. But like even Tom DeLonge has kind of like nonchalantly, sort of like a passive aggressive teenager would write in his diary. He's sort of talked about hybridization and Anunnaki. So they're also interested in
Yes.
the bloodline thing. I think they're holding that pretty close to their chest.
Right.
But if you put him into a wobble, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
Bobo wobble.
The Bobo.
They're going to make him King Bobo before this is over.
Well, I mean, I might be passionate about it too for $35,000 of pocket cash. What do you want me to talk about, you know?
Excellent. Hey, Anunnaki, it's your Anunnaki paycheck. Now we're talking.
Make this tweet, Tom.
And Elizondo's like, I'm so misunderstood.
Where's my baseball cap? It makes me look relatable.
Especially when it's on backwards.
Yeah.
Let's not forget to call him Lou. Lue. No more Louis Elizondo. It's Lou. Do you understand? That's their new thing now in the press releases. They're all Lou.
Oh, we like to make fun of them.
It's like a screwball comedy. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. We're in episode X68 with Gigi Jung, and we've gone deep now on Lindbergh at Roswell with von Braun. We've gone deep in looking at Lindbergh with Cayce, and Lindbergh talking about how we lost World War II. And Lindbergh with Buzz Aldrin's dad and their tight relationship there, which was forged and created the rocket center for Robert H. Goddard. And I have to say, that's 1934, 13 years before the Roswell incident in Roswell, shooting off rockets. It makes you wonder, on one hand, if the Roswell incident wasn't, yes, indeed alien, but that the UFO technology that they were flying there it was their own disaster in a sense, that they were trying to fly UFO material. It's possible. It's certainly possible, especially when you see figures like von Braun and Lindbergh show up there. It's worth taking a gander at. I have to say, I've never bought the idea that, this was just an experimental craft that exploded or was just a Nazi craft. I do feel that there's an alien aspect in it. So either they're flying alien technology or it is an alien crash. But the fact of Lindbergh and von Braun being there, I cannot get over that. And I cannot get over how little that's covered in the UFO field.
It's true. Well, I mean, with the extraterrestrials, I mean, they, obviously like Maria Orsic channeled extraterrestrials, and they could have very well had all those elements in play. So
there's a man named Maximilian de Lafayette who did a real detailed history on Maria Orsic. And we know that Maria Orsic disappears from the record books in 1941, and it's caused even good authors to suggest, oh, she was something that was invented in Nazi mythology or whatever. Well, he went very deeply, and he found that her family actually had royal connections, and she was a very real person and had been around working with the Vril Society for years. And he also found that for 6 months that Lindbergh was in Germany, he met with Maria Orsic. So it's interesting that you should bring that up. Very often people say that she, that you look like her.
I get those emails. But yeah, there's no relation that I know of to Maria Orsic. We don't channel the same anything, so.
It's come up a few times.
Mm-hmm.
Livy and I have fielded those too.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting when we get into it because Orsic is fascinating because she's part of a secret society. They're working on the whole alien contact question. And she has those abilities. So the idea that she meets and perhaps influences Lindbergh, I think, is quite extraordinary.
It's incredible. You have these people that are sort of enigmas in ufology, like Wernher von Braun and kind of Maria Orsic and Roswell, and here's Lindbergh intermingling with all of them, and we had no idea. So he was. There's a circle. There's kind of like a circle of people.
No question. No question. It is, and it's remarkable when we think about Ortzik disappearing. What Lafayette suggests in his book, which I think is interesting, is that she decides, oh, I have to clear out because it's World War II, and I'll end up, on the wrong side of this somehow. So her family arranges it so that she kind of disappears from history there, which obscures her entire trail. But she's a very interesting figure, I would say, back there that we have. And the fact that she met Lindbergh, I think, is very significant. I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to Miss Olivia. And now Miss Olivia's been taking your questions. You can still ask questions.
There are so many great questions already.
Okay. So we can start to roll with that now. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show, and we're going to take questions here for the next half hour or so with Miss Olivia at the helm. It's up to you.
Okay. So John K. wants to know, what does DJ think of Corso's book, Day After Roswell?
It's a fantastic book, and Philip Corso was the real thing. I mean, he worked at the Foreign Technology Office. He worked for Truman. He worked for Eisenhower. He worked for JFK. His basic thesis is that we re-engineered the crash from Roswell to get all kinds of things later, like lasers and all the rest of it. There's a lot of ring of truth to that, and I think that the publisher embellished his book, did some things to it, and so they weren't satisfied with just him coming out and saying this. But he got into incredible problems. We have to remember that he's somebody who worked with people like JFK, RFK, Eisenhower. I mean, he's a very high level figure who came out and told us that they were re-engineering UFOs. I mean, that's the crux of it. So I absolutely 100% believe that. What else you got?
Okay, hang on. So Gigi, I wanted to ask you this question. 1 second. Okay, so Esoteric 369 Wall wants you to answer. Could the endocrine autoimmune epidemic be related to the bloodline specialization? And I would widen that to ask, do you think they have intended to poison our endocrine system because it relates to the chakras, so that they can continue to have an edge on the rest of us?
It's very, very possible that, yeah, it's all, for this level of sick people, it's all about having the edge in every possible way. I think it's kind of like more like just put a lot of pollutants around, and then it sort of targets wherever you're weak. I think that's sort of, there's probably people who know more about the specific chemicals and toxicity than I would. All I can say is that there appears to be certain people who have what Spirit called the Atlantean endocrine system, or an Atlantean system, which meant a part of their being, for whatever reason, functioned in a different way. There may be certain things that can be done to specifically target that or to detect that. That's a really good question. I think if there are people that have this, and this is correct, I think that they probably would be more interested in recruiting them. And recruiting these people, and keeping other people definitely dumb or sick, so there's no friction. But I think for these people it'd be more recruitment. That's my impression. I didn't ask, but that's my impression.
I'm starting to really get a picture of where all the conspiracies sort of are coming together, and
theory of conspiracy, everything?
Well, yeah, that what we know is that the elites, if we know about the astrology, if we have the prediction, they are way ahead of us, right? And, the 20th century was very much about basically setting up an advantage, I think, for this time that we're living through right now, We know that we suspect that there's a culling that is going to commence. And the whole
Depopulation.
point, yeah, so that the idea was to keep us distracted and dumb, and to take all the money and all the resources and have it and set themselves up with underground bunkers for the time just probably next year, coming right around the corner. And this, I'm feeling like everything is starting to meld. It's making sense.
Fascinating. Let's keep rolling.
All right. So, Medley Childress wanted to know, what was Charles Lindbergh's highest degree number in the Masons? Was he a 33-degree Mason?
I don't have that information. My guess is based on his family that he was. However, I think that's something that we can check. I will say this, that the association came through his family. So I happen to think, in terms of the type of Mason that he was, one that was extremely special. And I think that his close work with presidential administrations and secret programs and, the Pentagon and set up for NASA under NACA and aeronautics programs, proves that he's just an incredibly connected guy. And I think that you can use those connections either, we're used to thinking, well, secret societies are bad and all the rest of it. What we've learned through the Steiner work is that you have the mystery schools, they're one branch, and then you have the left-hand schools. He also talks about extreme left-hand schools, but I think that that's the real split there between the mystery schools who are trying to move the culture forward and giving us that information, and the left-hand schools who are trying to manipulate these kind of, cosmologies and things like that. Okay.
So Shamanist Anam Kara asked a lot of great questions. So it feels like there's a great race amongst the elite who can claim Atlantis first.
Yes.
And Brenda Fisher asked, is the whole push for ancestry DNA to find the Atlantean bloodlines?
Gigi. 23 and Casey. Go ahead.
Mm-hmm.
Please, everybody out there listening, please don't, put your spittle in a little beaker and send it off to, 23andMe. Please don't do this. I do believe that this is a mass tracking or, data bank thing. And once you have your DNA there's esoteric components to that as well.
Yes.
And you mix that with technology and you're getting into some pretty weird territory. That's a no for me. So
big time. Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I do think one of the conversations I had with Dr. Farrell was about why they were using the X-ray scanners when they could have used those radio scanners that would give you the same information about if somebody was packing a gun onto a plane. And he came to the conclusion that it was possible that they were looking for deviation in somebody's physiology. And there were a lot of different things that we could extrapolate out of that they were looking for hybrids, or they were looking for people who had very unusual anatomy. I just think it's interesting. The program for 23andMe and for that genealogical background used the way that it is, it's so ripe to be exploited by these types of things that it's extraordinary, actually. And I have no doubt that they have, their kind of little contact points in there. So I actually think that it is a race, going to the first question, between who gets to Atlantis first in that sense. But what they don't realize, and I think, Gigi, you point this out a lot, which is you can't kind of apprehend something like the Two-Eyes Stone or the Hall of Records and have kind of low vibration priorities and be, kind of a psychopath and be able to use it. It doesn't work that way.
It doesn't work that way. And I think that the problem is that some people's consciousness just doesn't comprehend that. It's like it doesn't turn over.
Right.
It doesn't get it. It's limited. They don't understand that. They don't have the flexibility in their being to get that. But there are points where in consciousness where it'll basically just become like a mirror, or it'll just reflect shadow back to you. At certain points, it'll just reflect you back to yourself. And so in order to get through that, that's all of the quotes about, moving through the eye of the needle and having a pure heart and things like that. That's actually what allows these things to unlock. So, it's you're getting into quantum. Things go quantum, and that's something that it's just like you said, and like Casey said, it's different.
No question about it. It's actually very interesting to me, though, because you could say on one hand, they both want to get to the technology first. Let's just use the Two Eyes Stone, which Casey said was what they ran these incredible power stations with in our ancient past. And we've talked, I mentioned Dr. Farrell, we've talked with him before about these archaeology wars where they're looking for these relics and they want them. So on one hand, we could surmise that what they're trying to do is make sure that they get to them first and they can utilize them. And I actually believe that they think that they can make this stuff work regardless of their, let's say, ethical makeup. However, they may also be absolutely determined that these people don't get their hands on them who can use them for an ethical, spiritual purpose.
Wow, I love that.
So that might be kind of a gate to bar them in until they figure out how they can use them from their own low state.
Yeah, and I think that the most important relics are yet to be found.
Yes.
And I think that there are some that are here, but some of the really major ones are still beneath the sea. And like the really big ones, I think, in my opinion, there's a Sphinx down there. Isn't that what I think did Zaleski say that?
Yes. Yes.
There's stuff down there, and certain things don't turn on until certain times. There has to be certain cosmic overlays in the ethereal, in the etheric, that unlock it and turn it on. There's so many different complexities to it that have to be factored in.
No question. Gigi, you and I looked at unconfirmed reports of someone finding a lot of relics under Bimini, and the story kind of quickly disappeared. Casey's pointed to Bimini as the point. That's the place where the first risings take place. They found the Bimini Wall. J. Manson Valentine, this name Manson, which of course is the same name as Charles Lindbergh originally, M-A-N-S-S-O.
Right. Are you going to say what I?
Well, I know Charles Manson
Yeah.
comes up there. It is interesting. Names shift around. But J. Manson Valentine, the Yale zoologist, he's the one who finds the Bimini Road. And he's also the one who worked for 14 years with Morris Jessup, who I believe was rubbed out by the Sex Protect group on the UFO side. But here he is. He comes out and he says, I found the Bimini Road. Well, Casey had predicted, you know what? The Bimini Temple, the first parts of it are going to be discovered there in 68 or 69, not so far away. 68 or 69, they find it in 68. In September, so we have all that background, but Gigi, and we have a lot of reports flying around what might be under there, and we've had Paulina's finds off Cuba. But what do you think is under Bimini or off Bimini?
Well, whenever I've psychically seen a few things. One of the things that is definitely, I've seen the observatory, which is it's kind of like it's like an observatory, but not the kind of observatory that you use a telescope for. There's like a little hole in the top, which is actually it's called an oculus, but I didn't realize that until like later. But there's a thing that goes through, and what it does is it allows ether to gather in kind of like a dome. and then the person will stand there, and that's usually like a priestess or whatever will has to set the tone and everything. But what happens is on the ceiling, all of these different visions can appear, you know, star visitors or higher dimensional beings or visions. It's kind of like a big scrying ether will appear. And that's actually where I believe we get a lot of our murals on the ceiling, you know, when the angels are dancing and they're peering down. I believe that's actually from Atlantis and are the part of the psychic technology in the temples that would allow the ether to gather into a mist, and then things could be projected psychically onto the mist. That's just one of the things that I've seen that I believe is there. But there's lots of different things I think will be
That's
fun.
incredible. That's an Atlantean technology that's left over.
That's an Atlantean technology, psychic technology. Yeah.
Fantastic. Incredible. Your connection, whenever you connect in, I've noticed with Bimini, it's remarkable. And when we think about psychic archaeology, you know, that's what we want. We want you working on that area. And that's something that, you know, I very much look forward to have you doing, because I think that there are a lot of answers there. I think that the history is such that we now have enough proof that with the Bimini Road, for example, and with the Hemingway's interest and work, and the Healing Well, which is now nobody seems to know where that is now, and with the Cayce readings, that there's enough of a pinpoint there that it's something that is such an obvious target to go after to find some of these truths. You know, I often point this out, which is I'm so interested in the things that they find around Antarctica. But let's face it, it's about as difficult to get real data out of Antarctica as it is. You probably have better data from outer space from the point of view of a civilian research. But Bimini and the HotZone is not so far away. It is actually something that's within our grasp. And although it's incredibly, such a hotbed of geopolitical tension, Cuba especially, and they are driving Cuba into the ground with the incredible sanctions that they're laying on them. They're just, you know, they're making it impossible for them to have a self-sustaining country. I think that's all related to the HotZone activity. But nonetheless, those Bahama Islands are still very accessible to us. And so that's where I think a lot of this goes. And I've often pointed out that a dream expedition is Gigi and Paulina Zalitsky, the psychic side and the incredible engineer side, going together on this expedition and seeing
Atlantis just starts rising
the minute you show up. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. We're on episode X68. This is the Lindbergh Roswell mystery, and of course, is a major Atlantis hot zone. We're here with Gigi Jung, who has amazing new courses coming out in November, and you can find those at gigiyoung.com/new course.
That's it.
Bingo. I've got it down. You want to be in there early too, because get in there before it fills up. Also, we're going to take a few more questions here. Actually, Miss Olivia.
Gigi, I was wondering, have you ever done any dowsing for answers?
I've never dowsed.
Mm-hmm.
One time I had a dowsing set in my Amazon shopping cart, but then I never got it.
Interesting. Not for you. Okay.
Short-circuited.
Okay, so Najat Madri. Has DJ done any research on Epstein's breeding plan, and was he trying to recreate an Atlantean breed?
I do think that there's a lot to this.
More research needs to be done, for sure.
Mean, what I will say about Epstein is, you know, this is somebody who, it goes beyond the realm of just, you know, a regular psychopath. I mean, he's really deep working with programs. He has all this money in association with MIT. Over here, you have the people he worked with at MIT not wanting to give the money back, even after he died, and there's all that scandal. They have moved the Epstein issue off the front page, and so a lot of it's being buried. And the funniest thing that I saw was when the judge said, well, the case is done, you know, all these people waiting for answers, and they were like, well, he's dead, so, you know, you're not going to get any answers. I think that there's, you know, Epstein is like the dark side on this, which is those people do have a lot of knowledge, and I think they do monkey around with ideas of DNA and transhumanism, and they are, they're throughout, they're replete in terms of our society, causing certain things. A lot of the push for Gender X is all about this as well. And, this gets into giving robots rights. And you recently heard Sophia the robot, Olivia's favorite robot, saying that she can't wait to have rights and, all this stuff. So they want to give their property, their robot slaves, they want to make sure they get human rights. Maybe they'll have the robots vote so they can vote them in. But I think that's a lot to that question. And so, what I see from that is that we have two forces working there, and Epstein represented the real dark side of that force.
Okay.
Yes.
So, Robert Ayala, DJ, what do you think is the real motive behind the Lindbergh child kidnapping?
I've never bought the money part, and I feel like it's unusual. I think we looked at some aspects, like when Casey said they dyed the hair, and Gigi thought that was ritualistic. We have to remember they could have been blackmailing Lindbergh based on something beyond money. And there are unusual things in relation to Lindbergh's son. One of the things that I've read is that he had some kind of let's say that it was not a defect exactly, but that there was something about his spinal curvature that he was going to grow up with a hunch or something, and that there are these forces that were related to Lindbergh's interests in eugenics that didn't want to see his son grow to fruition, or this could have been an occult game that was going on. On the face of it, it's an unsolved case, really, except that they pinned it all on Bruno Hauptmann. And there's no doubt, even according to Casey, he had something to do with it, but it was nowhere near the full picture on that case. Very, very unusual story and case. I think Gigi would agree.
Yeah, definitely. And anytime a firstborn son starts to get killed, I don't know, it just kind of sits in a weird way.
Yes.
I love this question. Jabramaki asked, Anne Morrow Lindbergh was a poet and a memoir writer. I wonder if she was into mysticism or participated in occult practices after her son's death.
Well, I'll tell you, there's a very interesting story there, which is that there's this royal in the UK. I can't think of his name right now, but he sees Lindbergh show up there and for this event, and Lindbergh literally harasses him and gets really intense about who's good, where do they do seances here, and who's good medium. And when he, I think the guy's name was Philip, and when he says to Lindbergh, well, I don't have that information, I don't know who does that stuff, that Lindbergh really just dropped him immediately and went to the next person to find out. So he was desperate to find out where he could get a good medium in London. So deep in the psychic soup, Gigi.
He's deep in there. That's for sure.
Yes.
Okay, so Grandma Tippy Toes wanted to know, Lindbergh seemed to walk in both worlds. Do you think that Lindbergh could have been a double agent for the Positive Mystery School? I wonder if the Nazis thought that Lindbergh had secrets they could extract.
No question. Absolutely. They wanted his loyalty. There's no doubt about it. And they wanted to recruit him in earnest. And when you think about his second family over there, it makes you wonder. But, Gigi, you and I talked about this, which is it seems like with his grandfather being in Sweden and them coming here, it seems like this is an effort by a school or branch of a school to install somebody here to, this thing about whatever the school is associated with, it has to do with the heavens. And we get a little bit, I think about Walter Bosley's work with NIMSA when I get into this part, because when you start engaging, if you think about how Lindbergh got here under those unusual circumstances, and then the name changes, and then the August tie-in, and then the archaeology tie-in, we're looking at something that's kind of the fingerprint of the school, mystery tradition. And so it seems like that school and again, being around Buzz Aldrin, who's going to be the father to the second man who walked on the moon. It's all about the heavens, whatever that school is associated with.
Yeah, like cosmic pharaohs, you know. That's the thing. Yeah, there's definitely something going on
That's a
there.
great name for a miniseries on Netflix. Cosmic
Yeah,
Pharaoh.
I love
She
it.
nailed it. God, Gigi, you got it. All right, what else you got?
Okay. So Shamanist Anam Kara again says, is it possible that the names are a portal? Names like keys that unlock a process.
Gigi.
I would absolutely agree. That's something that the ancients knew that, and what we give our voice to creates waveforms, it creates portals, spells. Absolutely, it absolutely is a portal. Yeah,
No question. Well, the name's a signifier too. Like, if I need to find you,
yes.
the name gives me that. It's like
The steganography.
It is. It's name steganography.
It's name steganography.
You got it, Miss Olivia.
Bad Wolf said, before the idea of aliens, didn't these craft come from Hollow Earth?
Look, I don't touch Hollow Earth very much. But
I think all of this is, I think we're going there. It's inevitable.
What's great is that Gigi will touch on this Hollow Earth idea, or inner Earth.
Inner Earth.
Yes. So, there's a guy named Mac Tonnies, Gigi, who claimed that there was a group underground, and this echoes the Coming Race book by Bulwer Lytton in the 19th century, that there was a group underground that he called crypto-terrestrials, and that they were just like us, but a little more advanced, and that they had been part of an earlier civilization. He wrote a very interesting book about it, and he died unexpectedly at the age of 34, I believe. Mac Tonnies is an interesting guy, and the book idea was interesting. How do you see that? How do you see underground?
It always kind of brings me back to the Tuatha De Danann, and how there was a battle, there was a fight going on between factions. Maybe we could look at that as mystery schools now. And they retreated into the inner earth. And so there's, we hear these stories and we know these things, and psychically I've seen this and I've connected with this myself. And the inner earth is kind of special in a way as well, because it allows for different density, and different things can go on there, and things like that. So, and a lot of people used to actually hold religious ceremonies in churches. A lot of my past life memories and memories going back in my life are around caves and things like that. You find a lot of stuff in caves, and that's all around the same inner earth. What did you call them? Crypto-terrestrials?
Yes.
Yeah, that's interesting. But I do believe that.
Fascinating. Well, when you talk about caves, in the mystery school stuff, in the Cayce readings, when he talks about Rata, he says, he received his enlightenment in cave, and his fires can still be seen there in the mount. So it's the mount or the cave. And you and I had a very interesting journey through this whole cave church idea last fall. And we developed it as part of an episode, but we really got into some ideas there. I think this is what you're talking about, which is that there's some understanding that that is like a Stargate, is it not?
It is. I think the word that was used in a channeling was twilight space. It was like I think it was called like a twilight room, or like kind of like a twilight space where, it was sort of like an in-between. Kind of like So
I know that there are some UFO guys like Grant Cameron who talk about this work around Zendras and things like that. And I do feel like, I mean, people can run away with that, of course, but I think the idea that the spots themselves, there are certain locations, this gets us into the weirdness around the Bermuda Triangle also, which is that there's a place, an interface of magnetic energy, probably in that case caused by the sinking of Atlantis or the stones being somewhere close by, but also by the strange effect of the water currents at certain places on the Earth. What's interesting is when you look at Lindbergh, he talks about when he goes over certain parts of the hot zone, his compass spins. And so he's giving us that indication long before the Bermuda Triangle or anything like that was in vogue. But quite fascinating. Yes, Miss Olivia.
I'm going to say, I think, I know that I'm going to get super new agey for a second, but, everybody's talking about the thinning of the veils and we're in a 4D zone as we go to 5D. And what I am seeing through you and your research is that we live in a multi-dimensional universe, and that it is responding to us and our intention and our expectation, and basically all realities exist at once, and depending on and all timelines exist at once. And so whatever you are magnetizing realities to you. So on one level, I don't know if there's an ultimate reality anymore. I think that, I think for people who want to perceive Hollow Earth, they're going to be in they're going to be in the existence. Mm-hmm.
Well, that is it. Gigi, this is right up your alley. This is the creation of a reality.
Absolutely. There are certain constants that we all agree to incarnate into that are part of our reality. So there are certain constructs that are there. How we respond to them and how we evolve them in or out of our life is up to us. So sometimes with the new age, we can get a little ungrounded and we can make everything relative. And we did choose to incarnate in this time. So there are like some constants, and the Earth has a certain structure and things like that. But as for the level of consciousness that we're anchoring into our 3D form, like how far our tree branches up and how much power we have over the material world, is completely up to us through, our spiritual psychic development.
Wow, fantastic. I think that's a really, it's an important realization, because when we take the idea that you create reality to a certain degree, you have that power and ability. I don't know how many of us take that seriously, but it's crucial, I think. Absolutely. Miss Olivia, the last question of the night.
I didn't know we were getting there already. Give me 1 second.
Yes. Musical interlude.
Okay, well, Eddie Stark was asking, so can you be very clear about what Lindbergh's connection to the Vril Society was?
Well, I mean, in Lafayette's work, he spends all this time with Maria Ortzik. It's over the course of a 6-month period. So was he influenced by Vril? I mean, I don't have him signing in to the Vril Society that day. I don't have that kind of evidence for it. But I think Maximilian suggests through Ortzik he had entree to that world. My suspicion is he may have come out of a world like that. I don't think it was anything too foreign for him. Honestly, when you look at Charles August Lindbergh and the other Charles August Lindbergh, and then you see him come in through this line from Ola Manson, I think that this is a mystery school placing a very important person the same way that they placed Blavatsky in America in 1875. So this is somebody who was destined to be dominant in this one area, and they wanted to know what he could do. But it seems to me he was primed from a very, I think they planned for him. There's no question about it. And his dad's instant rise to politics also was a very important congressman, and he ran for senator, but his whole, like, keep America out of the wars and things like that. So he didn't get to be senator, but there you have it already, which is that political push in that family. And then when we get around, these other families like the Kennedys and the Hemingways, we see that it's like they're in culture, they're in politics. Sometimes they're in Hollywood. Look at Hemingway's grandchildren, Mariel and Margot were deep in there. It is like they move, they're in the culture. They're there for a reason. They're visible for a reason. And I think that is crucial to think about. I think that we can retain the historical image of Lindbergh as the Spirit of St. Louis hero and consider the larger picture of what he was. We get a much richer picture, I think, that way. And we know that he was keeping secret lives. So the idea of extending that into the larger circles of those esoteric influences that were controlling him makes a lot of sense to me. Gigi, I guess one question that I have for you is, what was he doing with the aerial archaeology, and why was aerial archaeology a passion for him?
I think he was flying around looking for these sacred sites.
Yeah. And
I think he wanted to map them, and I think they wanted to locate them. And I think they needed somebody that could, locate these areas, and get a good view of them and what's going on. And I think he was kind of a team with his wife too. I think they were sort of like a unit, a little psychic unit.
Yes. Well, we have to remember that they were surrounded by those different elite groups who were trying to use them for one way or another. And his wife's dad was a partner in JP Morgan, and his best friend, as we saw, was working for Standard Oil. So this is just the kind of milieu that they were working around and trying to maintain a certain amount of independence, I would gather. One thing I didn't get to mention, but I'll just flash here at the end, which is that Lindbergh actually created a artificial heart pump, because this guy was an inventor also, sort of a jack of all trades, Gigi, and that's the cover of Time magazine with him demonstrating it there.
Wow.
Eventually, they would extrapolate this idea into a simpler model, and some of the very earliest ideas for artificial heart pumps and things like that came from Lindbergh experimenting with this. It's quite fascinating when you think about it. I'll let you do one more question.
Okay, Kate Schneider is desperate for me to ask you this. DJ, speaking of Hitler tonight, many believe he was the last to have possession of the Spear of Destiny. Who do you think might have this prized possession now?
Oh, this is a great question. Well, it's very interesting because, they say that one of the reasons why he annexed Austria is because the Spear of Destiny was in the museum there. And the Nazis had a habit of searching for these sacred relics and then using their occult power. This is another power that isn't seen. If somebody, for example, had their hands on a two-eye stone, not only do you get the technological benefits of something like that, but the incredible kind of esoterically charged power of a sacred object. And I think, that spear, there's been a lot of mythology around it. And one of the things that he was looking for and that he spent a long time sending people out to find was the Holy Grail. So he was very interested in the power of them. In terms of who has it now, it's my belief that in a lot of this, it comes out of researching Dr. Farrell's work, which is that those groups understood that the war was ending as early as 1943. And they started shipping all that stuff off to Argentina and New Berlin in Argentina, which was their idea. And I think if any of that is to be found, it would be in South America. Of course, we've found a lot of those treasure troves of these train cars full of incredible looted artworks from the Paris Museum and all the rest of it that the Nazis had. And over the years, gold bars and things like that have shown up, but not that Spear of Destiny. But that is an excellent point, and the sacred relics,
That'd
definitely.
be a great show.
Yeah, that you know that it's true.
There's a Hemingway connection with the Spear of Destiny being stolen.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
So the day that the Spear of Destiny was stolen and the annexation happened, the day after it, Hemingway's father went up to his study, quietly burnt all of his papers and all of his records, and then shot himself.
True. And this is absolutely fascinating. This line of Hemingway's and the incredible tragedy associated with it, and under some kind of compulsion to get rid of all of his records.
I've always found that fascinating.
It definitely doesn't sound like a traditional, this is a bank problem and I need to get rid of my files. It sounds more like a mystery school problem.
Sounds like a mystery school problem. It does, yeah.
Amazing. And it's the same mystery school problem that Brother Les would have just a few years after he did this incredible Bimini special, that he would take his life in the same fashion as Ernest, and then Margot would say the family's under great pressures, and then the same thing would happen to her, slightly different method.
It's like you think about it, and if these people are valuable because they're Zendras or because they have the endocrines, the proper setup, the Atlantean setup, you might get lied to a lot and exploited so that you offer yourself to these people, and then you find out somewhere along the way that it wasn't what it was. So you have these people are probably dealing with so much behind the scenes stuff that they can't even talk about. So
absolutely, it's a great point. And I guess when we look out at some of these families, we're looking at this battle between what we call X-Protect and X-Share over and over again. And that includes the Kennedys, the Hemingways, and now the Lindberghs. We can see that they're right in that same focal point of history. Just amazing. Gigi Jung, incredible to have you on the show. Everyone go to gigiyoung.com and find her work on YouTube. Just exceptional work. And we look forward to having you back because we're going to do the CERN Tarot Deck Part 2.
Yes, we are. We're getting into it.
And it's great to see you. Everyone, thank you for being here. We've had a great night doing the show. Miss Olivia, outstanding. And we can shout out to some people, I guess. Who's out there, Gigi? I see Najat. Great to see you. And that's good. Olivia. Wow, it's Olivia. I can see her right here. Living Soul, it's great to see you out there. And Cult Fan, of course. Avishai, fantastic to see you out there. Kate, thank you so much. Excellent question. Mark Gerard, Matt M, excellent to see everyone out there tonight. What a great show. It's been fantastic to have you all here. We will see you next week, Friday night at 8 p.m. for X Series episode 69. And there may be a surprise between here and there. And it's coming up soon. And Gigi, you just released a video.
I did. I usually do one once a week, but I just did one on kind of spiritual people that devolve.
Yes. And that's an interesting point, actually, which is you can get to that point, but you don't necessarily stay there.
No, that's your choice.
Great video, everyone. That one's a new one that she just had put up. And we're going to have Gigi back to do CERN Tarot Deck Part 2. And we did the first one. I still get questions about the first one from people. So this should be good. Thanks so much, everyone. We will see you next week. And
I have a few super chatters that I should thank.
I saw some people. Yes.
Yes. James Belch, Liberty Thunder, Scabtree Scabby, Mike Smith, Charles Marlowe, Matt M, Eric Ackerley, Liberty Thunder, Violet Lotus, Eric Vossler, and that's it. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Really appreciate the support for the show. Thanks for the pen. Excellent job, Miguel. I really appreciate it.
What does it say on it?
It says DJ.
Awesome.
On the pen. Nicely done. And the only reason I won't use it is because I'll instantly break it, like this one's going to be broken in the next show. And we will see you all next week. It's been fantastic to have you all here. Thank you for supporting the show. You can go to the, darkjournalist.com and subscribe for the newsletter. And, of course, subscribe to the site, get behind the show and the work that we're doing here. It's great to see so many of you out there tonight. This month, we have some incredible, and I do mean incredible, interviews coming up for you. And it's been great having Gigi here with us tonight. We're going to have her back again soon. So thank you, everyone. And the final question is, Miss Olivia, what's for midnight snack? I guess.
Wow, yeah, it is late. Definitely onion rings. Definitely.
Onion rings rule. Well, that works for me. And in terms of the spirit of St. Louis, I'm sure we'll come up with something good. And we had Charles Lindbergh deep in the hot zone tonight in this Roswell mystery. Just incredible. And I can tell that Lindbergh and his work, it just perpetuates out as we go.
Walter just showed up.
There's nothing like that late arrival. We're going to have Walter Bosley on the show on October 18th.
Awesome.
So he's coming up, and we're going to check out his new projects and some of the work that he did with Esoteric Napoleon. Just fascinating. Everyone, we'll see you next week, and thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Excellent questions. Thank you, Miss Olivia. Onion rings, sriracha.
I'm starving.
Sriracha. Well, here we go. End broadcast, but of course, as we know.
Oh wait, one last
No,
question.
It's gone. No, we're
okay,
done.
I'll have to ask you.
We will do it off air. Thank you so much. I mean, it's already cycling out.
Did Charles Lindbergh help Admiral Byrd's Antarctic expedition?
Dun 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 dun. Great question. We'll see you next week. Thank you, everyone.